Hello, everybody. Thank you for coming here after lunch, coffee, and probably more interesting discussions over coffee breaks rather than during the limited time we have for debate in the sessions. But we hope we can keep your interest as we have we're discussing in this panel one of the challenges that Europe and perhaps the world are facing today. And I think it's a challenge that is going to stay with us for the years to come. This panel is about the refugee emergency, but perhaps even the word emergency is wrong because it's not an emergency. Actually, as I said, it's a structural issue, and we have had to deal with migration challenges already in the past decades, and I think we're confronting new challenges, particularly in Europe today and in the near future. I want to be very brief and actually give the floor to the distinguished speakers in this panel. I'll just try to provide the context where we are today. I think one thing we need to emphasize and recognize and accept is that migration and asylum seeking is a transnational challenge. So it's not an issue that can be addressed by a country alone, and perhaps not even by the EU alone. I think there's been both positive and negative developments in relation to the refugee emergency of the last 2-3 years. We've seen an unprecedented wave of transnational solidarity. People who were not involved in civil society or in volunteer activities in the past, who really went out of their homes, went to train stations, went to refugee centers, and helped people in any way they could. And of course, we also saw a transnational movement of xenophobia rising, of concern. Sometimes concern based on real challenges, because a country had welcomed many people in a short period, but in other cases, xenophobia rising mostly by media debates and by misinformation. I think this, as all crises, the word crisis is a negative word, but I think crises usually bring about change, innovation, and transformation, and this one, refugee crisis, is not an exception to this. I have 5 developments in EU policy that I want to highlight before giving the floor to my fellow panelists. This crisis has given way to the compulsory relocation quotas. Who would have said it 5 years ago, that the European Commission would take such a strong stance and try to introduce compulsory relocation for asylum seekers? I think the frontier countries like Italy and Greece knew very well that they were exposed to high pressures, but even 3 years ago, if one said, we need to reform Dublin, we need to relocate people before deciding on their asylum claims, everybody would have said, no way. Second, we have had the creation of an EU border and coast guard a few months ago. Again, that was a development that had been discussed for some time, but it seemed that the political will was lacking, and suddenly here it is. Third, I'm just mentioning it, the reform of Dublin. I remember talking with some diplomats in Athens, I think it was in 2014, and the Danish ambassador said, you're saying it's unrealistic to deal with the refugee and migration flows just in Greece, etc. But do you think it's realistic to reform Dublin? And I have to say, I had to admit, no, it's not. But now it is, and that's really a new element. Another taboo that was broken, the temporary disruption of Schengen. It was foreseen after the tension between France and Italy in the post-2000, during the Arab Spring in 2011. This clause was introduced that Schengen could be temporarily interrupted, but in a way it was a taboo, and it has happened, and we have survived it. And fifth, and I think probably most important, and in a way the dimension that we will address in this panel, is cooperation with third countries, both countries of origin and transit countries. Again, that has been for long in the policy agenda of the EU, but somehow it appeared as either too ambitious a project, because the countries of origin and many of the countries of transit are countries which are facing really huge socioeconomic challenges, so to expect that they could deliver on several fronts often seemed too ambitious or too unrealistic a plan. And today we've seen a lot of innovation. I think we will discuss in a minute what were the positive and the negative elements of this innovation. But I think this is an element in which we need to spend some time and think of whether it can work, how it can work, what we have done. That's how we have phrased this panel. It's in a way a mid-term assessment, 1 year after the EU-Turkey statement, less than a year after the agreement with Afghanistan to improve returns to Afghanistan, and while efforts to cooperate with Libya are ongoing with very dubious results. I'm very pleased to have, as I said, a very competent and expert panel bringing together different voices from society, institutions, and academia. Eugenio Ambrosi for the IOM, Regional Director in the European Economic Area, Fabio Massimo Castaldo, an MEP, Giorgia Papagianni, who is also an EUI alumnus and is at the External Action Service, and Alexandra Ricard-Gay, who is a colleague of mine at the Global Governance Program of the EUI, and who brings to us also Canadian expertise in research and policy. Thank you very much. As we have agreed, I'll give first the floor to Giorgia, who will speak in a way the voice of the External Action Service, and then to Eugenio, who will give us the point of view from the IOM. Alexandra will highlight some of our most recent research findings on challenges on the ground, and I trust, Fabio, you will bring the citizens' wisdom and the citizens' concerns in this panel. Thank you, and we try to keep in time and open to Q&A afterwards.
Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you very much. Thank you, Anna, for this invitation. It's really an honor to participate. Let me start by stressing the fact that I think in the last couple of years, there was no such word being more abused than the word crisis. While in terms of terminology, the word crisis describes a de facto, indisputable, massive increase of flows to Europe, and also describes the need for immediate actions, labeling the situation as a crisis, and even worse, as a European crisis, does not do it justice. First, the refugee flows that Europe is experiencing are driven by geopolitical and economic dynamics primarily in the neighborhood. Let's name the Libyan and Syrian crisis, the situation in Africa, and these can be expected to continue in the years to come. Second, taking into account that refugees and IDPs represent only a percentage of the huge number of the total number of international migrants, that 86% of the world refugees are hosted in developing countries, and that 80% of the mobility in Africa is primarily within Africa, we cannot talk about a European crisis, but rather about a global challenge. The lessons that we've drawn from our experience these last couple of years were numerous. First, we cannot only see and address the current situation as a short-term crisis. Instead, we also have to address the root causes of forced displacement: conflicts, instability, abuse of human rights, lack of good governance, lack of employment, and lack of socioeconomic development. Hence, second and very important lesson, against public expectations, no quick fixes, no magical solutions are possible for a phenomenon that is extremely complex and multidimensional. Third, it became clearer than ever that neither the EU institutions nor member states alone can tackle the situation on their own. A joined-up approach, entailing EU and member states, which involves an active support and input from member states, is paramount. Fourth, any action cannot be focused to the EU or how the EU can handle this so-called crisis. The external dimension, and in particular the cooperation with third countries of origin and transit, as well as the involvement of the entire international community, is key. Migration, as Anna highlighted, is clearly a global challenge that requires a global response and global responsibility sharing, and most important, a strong political commitment of all the actors involved. It's along those lines and on the basis of those lessons that the EU response has been structured during this last year and is paid for the future. At first stage, obviously, a series of short-term measures primarily focused on saving lives and breaking the smugglers' model were the key issue. It was in this context that the EU-Turkey statement was agreed. Following almost a year of the implementation of this statement, the statement continues to deliver tangible results despite the challenging circumstances. At the same time, and it's important to highlight also this aspect, the EU continues to be a pillar of support for the most vulnerable Syrian refugees in Turkey, providing them with access to education and health, while at the same time efforts on resettlement are also ongoing. In parallel with these short-term actions, long-term actions were presented within the communication on establishing the so-called partnership frameworks. Indeed, this new partnership framework approach sets a new paradigm in the relations between the EU and third countries, and it's quite innovative, not only in terms of combining short and long-term measures, but also on a series of further aspects. And I would like to highlight 6 of them. First, a strong joint venture between all EU institutions, and most important, between EU and member states, was cemented. In the last months, there has been a step change in the level of coordination between the EU institutions and the member states, with strategic planning of high-level visits in third countries, coherent messaging, shared feedback and reporting. Second, migration was firmly embedded in the EU's overall relations with third countries, and it was consolidated as a key issue in the EU foreign policy and the EU global strategy. At the same time, all possible options of the use of foreign policy tools, such as CSDP, are also being used. Let me at this point refer briefly to Libya. It goes without saying that the overall primary objective remains achieving political and security stability in Libya. Yet, at the same time, taking into account the great number of people that are risking their lives to cross the Mediterranean, and also the appalling conditions in the detention centers in Libya, work is also being intensified on all levels as regards more immediate and medium-term migration-related actions. Operation Sophia, the Libyan Coast Guard trainings, our work on Libya's southern borders, as well as the work on the protection of migrants and mobility stabilization should be seen under this lens. And I'm sure that Eugenio can further develop on IOM, on our joint work in Libya. Third, it needs to be underscored that the approach is at the same time both holistic, and when I refer to the word holistic, I refer to the fact that it's going beyond strictly migration-related issues and is exploring the links with other EU policies, but at the same time, it's strictly tailor-made and based on the specific needs of our partners. Here I would like to make a short parenthesis, and I would like to anticipate a question that will come for sure. No, the EU is not considering of replicating the EU-Turkey model, which de facto is something that cannot be just cut and paste on situations that are deeply varying. As stressed, the approach of the EU is strictly tailor-made to each partner. Fourth, partnership is the key word. Building relations that are based on mutual understanding, trust, win-win approach, and joint responsibility are the cornerstones of the new approach. In that sense, we see the partnership framework not primarily as a win-win approach, and certainly not as a way to deposit migration management on our partner countries. Fifth, another innovative aspect of the EU approach is the joint venture between the public and the private sector interests and efforts. The external European investment plan is expected to function as a central tool in sustaining the entire approach. Last, but certainly not least, I would like to underscore the responsibility of our partners, of the third countries, not only in terms of their political commitment as to working together on migration-related issues, but also in terms of linking this broader EU offer and efforts with their own strategic choice to proceed to a series of structural reforms that are deemed necessary for their socioeconomic viability and prosperity. In that regard, the external European investment plan will be fundamental, not only in terms of the major impact that the private sector would have on their economic development, job creation, and growth, but also because it offers the necessary technical assistance and as to the identification and implementation of reforms related to institutional building. Despite the mixed results until now, a year after the launch of the partnership frameworks, we're convinced that the approach is the right one. The example of Niger, where we have seen an unprecedented reduction of flows to Libya, is certainly encouraging. Yet, it needs to be clear to the minds of everybody that this entire effort needs to be seen primarily in terms of a marathon requiring long-term commitment and sustained efforts from all the sides that are involved, and not in terms of a sprint offering quick results. Let me conclude by attempting to dismantle another misconception. Over the course of the last year, the EU has been heavily criticized of not doing enough in terms of migration. And even though I admit that certain things could have been done differently, I simply don't agree with this conclusion. More concrete progress, as Anna has said, has been made over the last year than previously achieved over many years. Indeed, the EU is de facto leading by example at global level. It remains the world's leading humanitarian and development aid donor. Its actions have saved thousands of people in the Mediterranean, and the EU financial assistance to the victims of the tragic conflict of Libya is second to none. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Georgia. I'll give the floor to Eugenia.
Thank you, and good afternoon to everybody. Thank you, of course, to the European University Institute for the invitation and for the possibility of being part of this panel. I will briefly focus on just a few points that have to do with how we see the policy development in this area from the standpoint of an international organization that deals with migration. I will concentrate more on some of the overall challenges that we see right now more than on specific key development, policy development. Joanna mentioned 5, principle 1, which are all extremely important. I have actually counted 21 from 2015 when the Common Agenda on Migration came out until last month, without counting various communication, et cetera, which obviously testifies to a flurry of activities in this area, which is particularly strong and at times particularly confusing in many respects. Let me start by confirming what Georgia was saying. We never believed that this is a refugee emergency or a refugee crisis for 2 reasons. The first is because it's not a refugee, whatever. It's a mixed migration situation. In fact, the number of refugees that are, the bona fide refugees that are arriving in Europe are, depending on the moment you count them, but anywhere between 40% and 60% of the total. All in all, more or less half. So it's not a refugee, it's a mixed migration, and it's not an emergency, because we are talking in the last 2.5 years about 1.8 million people that have arrived in Europe, which is obviously a fraction of all the movements, both of refugees and migrants, that happens around the world. The latest estimation talk about roughly 6% of the overall refugee population in the world that is in Europe. 84% of the global refugee population is in the global south, so in the poorest, less developed part of the world. So in terms of number, this is definitely not a crisis, it's definitely not an emergency. We have a very limited, in the grand scale of things, number of people arriving in a region that is the largest economic power in the world, one of the largest markets that counts among its members 4 out of 7 most industrialized country, and has an overall population of 500 million, so 0.3% of refugee migrants arriving over 3 years is by no means a an emergency. Just by comparison, only in 2016, 117,000 people moved from the east of Africa into Yemen alone. So a number that is slightly smaller than the overall number that arrived in Europe last year and went into Yemen, one of the poorest countries, and a country that is at war. So it's not a refugee or migrants or flow emergency or crisis. What it has been, though, and it continues to some extent to be, is a political crisis and a crisis of values for the EU. And the number of key policy development and the implementation of some of those key policy development, I think, testify the fact that there is a major questioning of some of the fundamental values on which the EU is supposed to be founded and existing. It was mentioned relocation. It's a major achievement. Its implementation has not been as effective as we all hoped for. I think as of today, we have had about 14,000 people that have been relocated across Europe out of the 160,000 that were supposed to be relocated. So a low level of implementation, and especially just a few EU countries that have actually actively participated in the relocation program. Some have performed far beyond and below the commitment. Some have refused, flat. They said, we're not taking refugees, we're not taking resettlement cases, we're not taking relocation cases. We question the principle of sharing the responsibility of those who arrive in Europe. So it's a crisis of values. It's not an emergency, operational, or another type of values. And I think we are seeing among EU member states a sort of conflict between upholding rights and having an approach that is based on the fundamental rights, based on the EU Charter on Fundamental Rights, and other parts of the membership that actually questions the need to have such an approach and to uphold such rights. Small example, the detention, indiscriminate detention of asylum seeker arriving in an EU country and asking for asylum. It's a blatant contradiction of EU legislation beside a blatant contradiction of human rights. And yet it's happening, and it's happening on EU territories. I think part of the development we have seen, or the issue we have seen, is that from the Common Agenda on Migration, there has been a growing divide between the proposal of the Commission and of the EU institutions in general and what the EU member states were actually prepared to do. And this divide has been growing and has been increasing. And you can see it also in terms of external communication. Georgia said we have no intention of replicating in Libya the EU-Turkey statement. I'm extremely happy to hear that. I think we are all happy to hear that. We are less happy when we see some politician from EU member states saying the opposite, publicly. This not only increases the divide between EU institutions and EU member states, but creates confusion within the EU, within individual member states, and in the outside world. What is it? Are we looking to replicate the EU-Turkey statement? We are not looking. Who is right? The EU institution when they say that? A given prime minister when he says the opposite? It's a little bit difficult to navigate into this confusion. And this brings me to another point that I think is pretty evident in several of the policy development over the last few years. And that is ensuring coherence of action and coherence of the various policy development among themselves. An example. We have in the partnership framework with the third country a whole chapter dedicated to, and a lot of action and a lot of money invested, by the way, dedicated to using return migration to the country of origin as a tool to foster development with proper reintegration in order to facilitate not only the individual reintegration but the community development of the country of origin from where the large flow arrive. And it's all built around cooperating between EU and country of origin. Then you have some other policy on return coming out of other services of the Commission that don't go in the same direction and that say we have to return as many people as possible in the fastest time as possible. We have to penalize those countries that don't accept returnees exactly the same way and the same level that we would like. And the whole issue of cooperation with third country disappears. So you have one institution of the EU that proposes a certain policy with the external world and another institution that proposes a conflicting policy with the same part of the world. And this lack of coherence doesn't help making not only action reasonable but also effective. And then you have, as a consequence, an issue of credibility. When you go to other parts of the world requesting that they abide by the Cotonou Agreement or other international provision, you have to be credible. You have to ensure that you are abiding by the international principle and international law or European law. If that is not happening, if you allow certain member states to breach international law or European law, then you're not credible when you ask Burkina Faso to accept their national. You're simply not credible. And I think that is the main challenge that we have. Last point, since I have less than a minute, we have seen great unity among the EU, member states and institutions, anytime there was an issue of passing a policy that was security focused. We see far less coherence and consistency anytime there is an issue of passing a policy that is protection or right-based. And I think that should worry us profoundly. Thank you.
I think our panel is working perfect because we're hearing two different voices and then...
Okay, thanks. First, thank you, Anna, for the invitation to take part in this panel. So we have a very challenging task of discussing a very complex issue in a few minutes. So I'll try to be brief, outline a few points that I hope we can further discuss in the Q&A session. So in my presentation, I intend to zoom in and focus on one particular channel, which is the Libya-Italy channel, and to outline some of the challenges in terms of protection for migrants. So while Greece and the eastern route has seen in 2016 a significant decrease in the number of arrivals, following the EU-Turkey agreement and the closure of the Balkan route, the number of arrivals in Italy has not diminished, has even increased. So for the last 3 years in a row, Italy has received more than 150,000 migrants arriving by sea. In this context, the Libya-Italy corridor is now the last major gateway to Europe. And as such, we see an increasing pressure from EU leaders to close that door toward Europe. So we know that the vast majority of migrants who arrive in Italy come from Libya. We're talking about 90–95%. They have used the services of smugglers, and they have been rescued at sea. So they are not autonomous arrivals in Italy. And we have to consider, when we think of protection, some of the distinctive feature between the central route, Italy, and the eastern route. So while Greece has received in majority Syrians, Afghans, and Iraqis, in the case of Italy, there is much more diversity in terms of nationalities. And the point that is needed to be stressed also is that the flows are mixed, as it has been outlined. So this brings another level of challenge in terms of international protection. So we're talking about mixed flows, including refugees, asylum seekers, and migrants who are also fleeing harsh conditions and seeking for better life opportunities, and also migrants fleeing Libya and the untenable situation and violence that occur in this country. So this has, of course, exacerbated the challenges and provided international protection for diverse groups of migrants. And this is even more so in Italy, since there's been a huge increase in the number of asylum claims. So between 2015 and 16, we're talking about an increase by 47%. So, and this is in part as a result of the enforcement of the hotspot approach, also the tightening of the northern borders, and the weak implementation of the relocation program. So this has led Italy to face alone the fact that not only receiving migrants, but also processing the claims and caring for them, which has, of course, put a lot of pressure on the reception system. So just to give an idea, 78% of migrants are in temporary reception centers right now in Italy. The other aspect that we need to have in mind is the high prevalence of violence that is perpetrated against migrants along their journey, mostly in Libya, not only, but today I focus on that. And this is important to take into consideration. So we have seen now empirical data, empirical evidence that shows, and we've heard about accounts also in the media, of severe violence, even torture for ransom, beatings, inside, outside the detention centers, also in connection houses, forced labor, forced prostitution, and rapes. So what we see is a lot of migrants arriving in Italy who have experienced several traumas, who may have specific needs in terms of international protections, but also social assistance. And of course, with the already overwhelmed reception system, it is not adequate or prepared in order to provide for those specific needs. Now I want to bring your attention to a very under-discussed challenge in terms of protection for migrants that is emerging right now, and that we have now been documenting in our research. So as we know, a core aspect of what is called the migration crisis, refugee emergency, is to deter irregular migration. And this goes hand in hand with dismantling smuggling networks. So this has been the core of the EU agenda and priorities. And what we see is that so there has been a multiplication of measures. I would like to go into detail, but I don't have the space here. But let's focus on the fact that the militarized and more securitized approach to border control has failed to crack down the smuggling networks in the Libya-Italy corridor. But there has been also, and this we know, but there has been also an unintended consequences of pushing migrants to take much more part in their own smuggling, and then having the risk of being criminalized because they have driven the boat. So what I want to highlight is, for example, with the Operation Sophia that has started in the summer of 2015, so the practices of the smugglers have changed. They no longer use big vessels that were seized and confiscated through those operations, which I should not call search and rescue, because the Operation Sophia, has a core mission and explicit goal of dismantling smuggling networks. So as a result, smugglers have changed their practice and they use dinghies. So now migrants have to travel on unseaworthy, overcrowded, small boats that they know won't reach the Italian shores and might be rescued on the way. And in addition of that, they ask and push migrants to drive themselves the boats. So what we're seeing is that not only the Operation Sophia has not led to reduction of smuggling, but has put migrants in even more dangerous position. And different situations may occur. So what we see is that migrants are given a phone, compass, GPS phone, and some indication. But different situations are behind that, or they have agreed to drive the boat because they didn't have the money. We have to remember that this is often the only way out and the only option to reach safety. They might also have agreed because they didn't have all the money and that permitted to have a reduced price, or they were forced and coerced. But either they were forced or voluntary drivers, the offense of having facilitated irregular migration should not apply to migrants who act in situation of necessity, and vulnerabilities. And also, a troubling aspect is that with these kind of operation, and also with the EU migration plan on smuggling, the collecting of intelligence, of information, and the investigative measures start on the boats, in high sea, and continue in the hotspot. So we have to question under which conditions testimonies are collected that might be used afterward to criminalize migrants. Let's hope that the practices will change and that no longer migrants will be criminalized once they arrive in Sicily, but more research is needed to document this problem. And we have to remember as well that collecting data in this situation, we're talking about migrants in the immediate afterward of traumatic experiences as well. Another tool that has been widely discussed right now to curb irregular migration is to foster cooperation with third countries or countries of origin, in this case, Libya. So as we know, early February, Italy has signed a memorandum of understanding, which is now stalled because the Tribunal of Tripoli has blocked this memorandum of understanding, and the EU leaders also agreed to a plan with Libya and to give to the UN-backed government 200 million euros. But this agreement is very worrisome. As you've said, there is no plan to duplicate the EU-Turkey deal, but the least to say is that there are no conditions to implement this kind of agreement. As said by the Libyan ambassador to Italy, we will stop boats from taking off from the coast and stop migrants from crossing into Libyan territory. Those apprehended will be escorted to the nearest detention facilities. So what we are now documenting in terms of violence against migrants in Libya, the same who are the perpetrators of violence, maybe the guardian of their human rights, this is a troubling situation. So there is no guarantee that human rights will be respected in the detention center in Libya. So I don't know if I have still a few minutes, but in terms of, okay, good. So I was going to the conclusion. So I think that the situation regarding the Libya-Italy passage is illustrative of the failure of the EU approach to stop migrant smugglers and curb irregular migration. What we now see is an increase in the externalization of border control, in other words, outsourcing containment policies in the transit countries, and more efforts for the return and deportation of migrants. And this will be accelerated in Italy, as we have seen now with the newly adopted Miniti Orlando decree. So as was said by the president of the Association of Juridical Studies on Immigration, ASGI, in Italy, there are many ways to build a wall, with concrete or with laws and rules. And what we are seeing right now is more restrictive access to international protection, measures that, whatever the categories of migrants, are preventing them to reach Europe in order to claim for asylum rights. Thank you.
You've raised a set of formidable challenges, and I'm not even sure I want to listen to Fabio, but go ahead.
Distinguished guests, dear friends, I'm really honored to be here with you today, highly reputed academics and officials around me, to discuss about one of the biggest challenges we are facing today. Indeed, the annual State of the Union is one of the most important fora for discussions and consideration of a broader perspective. Again, in this context, common solutions can be more easily identified. The phenomenon of migration is not a new one, and we cannot, as was said before me speak about a refugee crisis. But in the last years, the European Union has become the destination of increasing flows of people, coming particularly from Africa and Middle East. The Missing Migrants Project by International Organization for Migration documented the deaths of 7,763 people during migration to international destinations in 2016. In a world characterized by high and rising inequalities, the circulation of considerable masses of people may constitute a cause of widespread fears. We have the duty to take care of this fear because it easily turns into hatred. All around the world, we witness the same patterns, leading to the construction of new physical as well as psychological walls. It is a battle of the have-nots that can only have the consequence to make everyone, and especially the more fragile ones, lonelier and poorer. Solidarity is therefore the most important medicine, and the protection of human rights must be at the core of every action. But it is not enough. Since almost 3 years, the EU is confronted with a rich and continuous flow of migrants, and among them of refugees. Instability plays a huge role here. If we read carefully the list of countries where most refugees originate, and UNHCR gives us that list, the picture is quite self-explanatory. Not surprisingly, Syria and Afghanistan are at the top of the ranking, as they have seen more than 6 million people leaving and trying to find safety abroad. Instability on Libya, and speaking about Libya, I could say that is a clear example of this lack of coherence among the official agendas of the EU and the unofficial agendas of some of its member states. Instability on Libya, on the other hand, has another consequence. While the country produces a relatively low number of refugees compared to what we would expect given the situation on the ground, its internal instability and the permeability of its borders turn it into a perfect transit country for huge flows of people coming from Somalia, Sudan, South Sudan, Democratic Republic of Congo, and Central African Republic. While migration was already a challenge before, the military intervention and the beginning of the civil war in Syria in 2011 have brought the phenomenon to another level by both creating new refugees and, at the same time, creating new ways of transit for them. Indeed, the refugee crisis is, at least since 2015, among the priorities of the EU agenda, but the reaction put in place has clearly proved to be not enough efficient and not enough effective so far. This has caused a wide and vivid debate in the public opinion, in which messages of solidarity towards refugees and migrants in general get mixed up with the racist reactions. In order to handle the contingency in 2015, as it was mentioned even before, the Council adopted two emergency relocations mechanisms to help Greece and Italy to deal with the refugees emergency, but they have proven to be a failure. There is a clear lack of solidarity and political will to share in equal terms the responsibilities towards those people arriving in Europe, fleeing from wars and persecutions, and seeking for protection. According to the last available report on the relocation from Italy and Greece, published by the Commission last March, out of the 160,000 people that needed to be relocated, only 14,500 were effectively relocated from Greece and 4,400 from Italy. 145,500 people are still waiting for relocation, and the emergency instrument will expire next September. Indeed, solidarity between member states on the issue appears to be only a formal engagement written in the treaties. Apparently, it does not work on the ground. Again, from the very beginning, the crisis has shown the shortcomings of the common European asylum system and has actually resulted in its collapse. The Commission has reacted by presenting a new package of 7 legislative proposals. These are aimed at reforming the CEAS by making its provisions more binding for the member states in order to prevent third country nationals to stay illegally on the territory of the EU and prevent secondary movements of asylum seekers from one member state to the other. However, the proposed revision of the Dublin regulation has clear shortfalls. It actually draws a system that is even more rigid than before, and it does not allow for any type of flexibility in relation to the country responsible for handling the refugee status applications. By introducing the hotspots approach, where all illegally arriving migrants are fingerprinted and registered under the supervision of the European authorities, and tightening the rules of Dublin regulation, the Commission wants to achieve a twofold goal. Make sure that all illegal migrants are registered upon arrival, and make sure that the countries of first illegal entry are responsible for possible applications for international protection. This will de facto transform countries like Italy and Greece into the refugees camps of Europe. Only when the asylum systems on the frontline member states are about to collapse, only then, the Commission allows for a corrective allocation mechanism to kick in. Such a mechanism would allow for the relocation of asylum seekers in other member states. In order to give an immediate response to citizens afraid by those waves, member states concluded last year the well-known and highly controversial agreement, or so-called agreements with Turkey we were speaking about before, which furthermore has no legal base and representing, in my honest opinion, a dangerous precedent, both political and juridical. We are basically paying that country to get rid of the problem, but we are surely not contributing to structurally solve it. That all not to talk about the fact that the deal with Turkey, which is now living a new season of attack to democratic principles, puts aside the alleged moral superiority of the Union. This holds both in relation to the championship of protection of fundamental rights and the respect of the democratic procedure for concluding international agreement foreseen by the treaty themselves. Migration has also an external dimension that the Commission wants to strengthen. It launched the so-called migration compacts that link development aids to the fulfillment of migration-related indicators, and it concluded readmission agreements with and giving money to countries considered safe, such as, again, Turkey, Afghanistan, the joint way forward, and in the near future, Libya. In parallel to that, and through the EU development and humanitarian aid policy, the EU has adopted a further emergency tool, the so-called Trust Fund for Africa. It aims at taking the deep root causes of irregular migration by pooling funds and stimulate investments in the third countries of origin of migrants. The 55% of world total funds for development already come from the EU, but their effective destinations and their efficient use have to be assured. Indeed, the risk is that behind what is said, the tool could turn into a border control and counter-terrorism instrument. Moreover, we are talking of an emergency tool, but the effects thereof are not necessarily sufficient in the long run. To conclude, we need an holistic approach that faces the issues of refugees, but I would say migration in general, from all sides. The first necessary condition to achieve a concrete result is, however, solidarity, both between member states and inside them. The revision of the Dublin regulation must go in the direction of a real share of responsibility based on a compulsory, preventive, and permanent system of reallocation with the protection of fundamental rights as lighthouse. The attempt to escape this legal, political, and moral commitment cannot be tolerated and should be sanctioned, in my honest opinion, with a freeze of the structural funds. The European Union, with the Brexit ahead, the effects of the economic crisis spreading increasingly around, the recrudescence of terrorism and the refugees crisis, if we want to call that with let's say, the common definition, to tackle is definitely having hard times. This all risk could furtherly erode the already weak European citizens' support towards the EU and eventually bring to a possible future collapse. In order to prevent it, the EU has to turn this difficult moment into an opportunity. We have to turn the difficult moment into an opportunity to change and finally provide good and viable solutions to citizens' main problems and concerns. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Fabio. I think we have a fundamental agreement in the panel that certain steps have been made, a lot of efforts have been made, but the challenges are complex and a lot needs to be done, and I really appreciate, Fabio, that you concluded with some proposals and even some strong ones. I would like to invite Eleonora Milazzo, who is an EUI PhD researcher. We have this front row discussion system this year, so we give a young person first the floor for questions, then I'll take more questions from.
Yeah, thank you very much. Anna, is this on? Can you hear me? I can try to speak louder, maybe. Thank you. So thank you very much. Thank you for your presentations. You also mentioned that this is actually a crisis of political values, and there was a word that was a recurring term in your presentation, and it's very much a buzzword these days, and that's solidarity, which is enshrined in the TFEU, which is really a buzzword everywhere we look these days, and it's often used in connection to the fair sharing of responsibility. So it's solidarity between states, it's solidarity towards asylum seekers, but what is not really clear in the debate, and for what matters in the scholarly literature as well, is what the content and the scope of solidarity should be. So my question for you today is, well, what you think that the limits to solidarity should be, if any limit, any constraints should be put to the duty of solidarity that we talk about. So is there any ground on which solidarity should be constrained, if any ground there should be at all, in order to safeguard some other supposedly competing values, for like national solidarity, for example, or security, again. And this is not only with reference to the policy responses at the EU level and at the national level that we just talked about, but it's also with reference, for example, to NGOs and volunteers who are directly involved in coping with this, with the so-called crisis, and whose work has been recently the object of a widespread debate. So I was wondering what your thoughts on this are. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thanks, Monica Baldi, European and national former members of the Parliament. And anyhow, I'd like to ask you something, because we didn't talk about the priority that the Malta priority in this presidency is very important, because when we speak about refugee, sometimes we talk a lot about Italy, Greece, Cyprus, and we forget Malta. Malta, in this case, I was really impressed because we made a special visit 2 weeks ago. We went to the European Asylum Support Office, and they are making an impressive job. And so I'd like to ask you, what do you think about? And then even something that Fabio Massimo Castaldo said about the relocation. They are doing an impressive work about that. But first of all, they ask even the support of everybody, even because not only for the state that don't take care of what's going on, but even it's very important the coordination of intelligence. So this is one of the points that we have to discuss too, because sometimes, yes, when we talk about refugee, and it's no more emergency, but it's a governance, we have to take care even of the information inside the states. Intelligence like information, and to have this coordination and this to share the information about the people, because as you know, it's very difficult even to figure out what they are or who are they, okay?
And thank you, Monica, for presenting yourself. Please state your name and, if you want, your institutional affiliation.
It doesn't work? Thank you. My name is Joseph Licari. I am a former Maltese ambassador to Brussels, Paris, Strasbourg, but I speak in my personal capacity. So, migration is a demographic issue. Demography is a matter of numbers. Let me cite just one number. Africa, population 1.2 billion. How many of them would come to the European Union given an opportunity? How many should the European Union take? How many could it take? If it were to take 1 out of 20, that would be about 60 million, equivalent to the population of one of our larger member states, namely Italy, France, and so on. So the whole thing is unsustainable. In any case, we already have unemployment of over 9% in the European Union, the pressure for unemployment to increase will go on over the next 10 or 20 years as a result of robotics and artificial intelligence. Our member states will be under pressure to provide employment for all those jobs that will be lost as a result of technological advances. So the European Union cannot take in large numbers of migration. In any case, development has never been the right solution for development to take place by people moving to jobs. Development means jobs moving to people. And that is the objective of the Africa Trust Fund, namely to increase investment in Africa, thanks to the European Union, but especially thanks to Africa's own resources. There is a crisis of values in Africa. Corruption on a huge scale wherever you look. Angola, Zimbabwe, Congo, Ghana, Nigeria, they have all the resources in the world. But all the money goes into the pockets of the rulers, and the vast majority of the population remains impoverished with no way to escape from poverty. And I say poverty because President Grasso used the word poverty this morning. The only way to escape from poverty is to escape from the continent and to come to Europe. But poverty does not qualify a person under the Refugee Convention of 1951. And that is why the Refugee Convention is the only way for an uninvited, unwanted person from a third country to enter the European Union, and that is why it is abused on a massive scale. So this is why we should put the emphasis on it.
I need to give the floor to somebody else as well.
We should put the emphasis on Africa overcoming its crisis of values, namely corruption, and other measures that have been mentioned, like the agreement with Niger and the border tribes in southern Libya, for example, and relocation.
Thank you very much. I think my colleagues can elaborate more on this.
Just on relocation, agreement was reached on 160,000 being relocated. By the end of March, only 30,000 were relocated. In the meantime, in the last 3 years, 500,000 arrived in southern Italy, and this year it will be about another 250,000. There's no way relocation can take care of such huge numbers if they're allowed in. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. I have a question here.
Thank you for a very interesting discussion and for keeping with the time to the chair and the panelists.
Your name and
I'm Despina Chatsivassiliou. I'm an alumna from the EUI and currently work in the Council of Europe, head of political department. We heard concerns and doubts about the legality of the EU-Turkey agreement. My question is beyond legal doubts. To what extent, in practice, developments in Turkey where a state of emergency is in force since July last year after the failed coup d'etat have influenced the implementation of the agreement, and to what extent the developments may influence it in the future, especially after last month's referendum, which has been highly criticized by international and European observers. Thank you.
Yeah.
My name is Rainer Bauböck, SBS Department of the European University Institute. I have a slightly provocative question that has been bothering me. There seems to be broad agreement on the panel that imposed relocation quota is a good policy that is just weakly enforced. I'm in complete agreement that burden sharing is of utmost importance, and it does involve relocation. I think reforming Dublin should be on top of the agenda if you want to achieve that goal. But I have some doubts that sending refugees to countries where they don't want to go and that don't want to have them is actually a very clever policy if you think about what has to be done in order to provide maximum level of protection with integration opportunities to the largest numbers of people who need it. Economists have been suggesting for a while that there might be better ways of doing this. And one possible suggestion is tradable refugees, quotas. So instead of cutting on the structural funds, you might say, within that system of relocation, you either take refugees or you finance that other states take the refugees. A direct link between the two things. Economists have also been saying we should take refugees' preferences into account. Most people agree that you cannot say choose your own destination, but there could be a scheme of matching preferences between countries and refugees on an individual basis that optimizes their chances to get to places where they actually see that they would have integration opportunities.
Yes, hello to everyone. I'm Tapio Rantanen, working in the Finnish embassy in Rome. I would like to touch upon the policy response and the value aspect of this multiple crises in the form of the question directed to all of the panelists. Do you think that Europe will be able to guarantee equal rights for the children of those who have arrived in Europe in recent years, if they are born in or on their way to Europe or in Europe after their parents' arrival, whether they are given an asylum or undocumented, will they enjoy equal rights with other European children? And how, if we have to do something to guarantee that, how will we do it? Thank you.
Thank you very much. I'll take one last question at the back and then.
Well, thank you very much for your presentation. I mean, my question is, first of all, I would like to say that, I mean, Europe has another problem. It's a demographic problem. And also, I do agree, as the ambassador was saying, is that, okay, the solutions to Africa's problems are internal, but they are also external. And so my question is that in all the discourses and solutions that we have heard so far, there is nothing said about guest workers as one of the solutions to what is, as you say, a structural problem. From my experience is that there are a certain number of countries, like New Zealand, like Canada, who have actually implemented guest workers systems, not from the old kind, like we know in the 1970s, but seems to work very well. So do you think about that?
Well, very briefly, thank you. I just wanted to recount an article in a Dutch newspaper a few days ago, where it was about all the asylum seeker centers that were built in the Netherlands when nobody ever arrived. So there were mayors who were complaining against the central organization in the Netherlands, saying, well, we got our populace to accept an asylum seeker center, people have been hired, they now have to be fired, because all those refugees who were going to come never arrived. And there you see the mismatch in what's happening in Italy and what's happening in the northern countries. And I think, I mean, a lot of people have asked about the relocation policies, but my question would be about the enforcement side of the relocation agreements, however small these are.
Thank you very much. I think we have, a very good set of questions. We'll try to give answers. Fabio goes first.
I will try, even if I should admit that we would need maybe more than an hour normally to discuss about all the items and all the aspects that were mentioned during your questions. I will start from the first one. You ask, what's the limit of the solidarity? I think it must be an equal solidarity. So in that case, as you said, we're speaking about the duty. It's a juridical one. It's inside the treaty. We're not speaking just about the moral. If the EU is a community also, in a spirit, a community of states, a community of populations, we cannot think that this community could be on demand. And that's what I said, for example, to the Visegrad countries in the past. You are asking solidarity face to Russia for the sanctions. You do not want to provide solidarity face to the migrant crisis. Where is the coherence of this approach? And so, once more, I'm advocating in favor of a system in which we will speak about the relocation, not just on a demographical criteria, but also on economical and considering the possibility also to absorb that offer of work and that offer of being completely integrated into the society, also from a work and economical point of view. About the question about the intelligence. Of course, this is also a matter of political will. Let's be frank on that. When we are speaking also about cooperation for coordination of intelligence of counterterrorism, we have the instruments and the tools to do that. There are the platforms are already in place. Some terroristic attacks could have been prevented if all the states would have had the will to share these informations. So instead of as some of my colleagues sometimes said, advocating for new tools and new instruments, the first goal is maybe to spread this culture of cooperation and intelligence. And so also I will take as mine your request to pay attention also about the situation of Malta, even if I should say that from numbers, the number of migrants they are helping and receiving in the last years, it's a bit decreasing if we compare as it was in the past. Maybe because, let's say that the main part of these flows is going more from the direction of Italy than to Malta for maybe a kind of this political decision of how to apply the laws that are now in place and the political will of the Maltan government. About the migrations as demographic issues and the pressure for unemployment, it's true. This is a balance we should consider. And I would like to add to the effect of robotics and artificial intelligence also the effect of the so-called forced globalizations and some free trade agreements that sometimes have clear effects, even much more wider than what they are explained when we sign up this kind of agreement. Nevertheless, we have to tackle this phenomenon because we cannot think really that this is just too big to be solved. And as I told you before, we could have different tools. One, it could be this system, this preventive system before the collapse. But on the other hand, if we are speaking about development and we are speaking about corruption, we should also check very well the way we are investing in our funds for cooperation. One of our proposals was, for example, to divide the funds and the programs in quotas. Show me in which way you are investing the first quota I gave to you for this program. If the quota is really invested and it really is used for the purposes for which it was allocated, so for the development and growth, I will give you the second, I will give you the third. It could be a first example. And the second is very important that also all the European governments and the ministers of foreign affairs will stop to play two roles, the official and unofficial one, backing sometimes governments that are clearly corrupted, not efficient, and trying to be really more united, not just in words, but also in practical means. About the legality of the EU-Turkey deal, I was one of the strong opponents since the beginning, because for me it's not even a deal. I'm sorry, but if we are speaking about a deal, there are procedures, and the parliament should have voted with the procedure of consentment. This procedure was not respecting. We never had a vote, and in the narrative also of the EU institutions, when we are asking for a vote and the position of the parliament, this is just a statement. When Erdogan is asking to fulfill what is written in this statement, it becomes a deal because we do not want to disturb too much our Turkish ally that is also a NATO member. I think that in our relationship with Turkey, and this is just the last example, we played a lot of hypocrisy in the last years, since the period in which we said, let's reopen negotiation, but at the same time, Sarkozy was in favor of to create the European for the Mediterranean. That was just the space to say this negotiation will never end. We will have here the new framework, a new forum in which Turkey could stay. It could have been maybe more sincere to say since the beginning that some governments were facing completely against the possible enlargement to Turkey, and to build up a relationship that will be also coherent on the European principles. And on this regard, sorry to say, but this referendum, the way it was managed, the result and the concentration of powers in the end of the president nowadays is not at all compatible with the European values. And what is democracy? Democracy is not just to vote every 5 years. It's a matter of balance of powers inside the democracy, inside a state, and this is not respected nowadays in the new structure of Turkey. Those are not my words. I also spoke with Professor Bukicchio from the Commission of Venice that explained us from a technical constitutional point of view how much it's unbalanced, the new constitution. And last but not the least, because I don't want to answer to all the questions, there are too many, unfortunately, about reforming Dublin system. We are working on that. We have already a proposal, and unfortunately, as I said during my speech, this proposal is maybe going in the wrong way, not in the right one. If we will eliminate criteria and possibilities of flexibility, taking into account also the family state and other criteria that now are existing exactly to give the possibility to adapt to the situation, a strict rule, we will fuel more and more the sentiment that just some countries has to deal with and not the Union as a whole. And second, about sending migrants with an enforcement. For me, this is still about the rules of a community. I cannot accept that when we are speaking about monetary union and we are speaking about budget and finance, if somebody is not respecting a rule, there is a clear procedure for infringement with high sanctions, and there is not the same when we are speaking about solidarity and a migrant problem that is not just with a single responsible, but it's maybe of the responsibility of the whole West, of the commercial policy, the foreign policy, we put in place for decades and even for centuries, I could say. But I also think that the sanctions could not be just to pay the bill. With an amount for migrant. It's the proposal nowadays of the Commission. They say 250,000 euros per migrant. I would like to ask to all of you, does a life has a cost? Does a life has a cost? We could evaluate the cost of a life of a person with 250,000 euros first. And second, I'm sure that there will be several countries that will be very happy to pay the bill and not having the migrants just for, let's say, political decision, just because I must unfortunately recognize many of the leaders inside the European Council are more focused on next elections than on next generations. But this is fueling also the sentiment of racism, and that we are seeing even in countries like Germany that were not experienced that since a long time, or in which there were some experience, but the very small dimension. So that's why I still think that there are no perfect solutions, but maybe the most reasonable one is to stick with the idea to have this preventive compulsory system of relocation. Everybody has to fulfill his duty, and I think that the sanctions of the structural funds, it will be not just the most effective one for its amounts, but moreover for a pedagogic purpose, because that will teach some countries that being a community is also being together, not just in the good times, but in the hard times as well. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Fabio, for a very passionate set of answers. I'm afraid I'll have to be a bit stricter with the other speakers, asking you in 1 or 2 minutes to give some answers, because I see my colleagues signaling that we have come to the end of our time.
So very quickly, I would pick on three of the questions. The first one that I really appreciated on the solidarity issue, and actually I wanted to throw out something that is quite controversial now at the moment, but which is the allegation of collusion between NGOs that conduct the search and rescues with the network of traffickers or smugglers. So this shows the limits of the solidarity, what is accepted, and also how the migration management is perceived right now. We need to put it upside down, not to look at the symptoms of the system and criminalize those who are saving lives at sea, but really look at the root causes and what is before that. So this is one of the, and this came also with the Mare Nostrum, which was seen as incentive for smugglers in order to send more migrants. Again, this is to look at the symptoms, and this is also a form of solidarity, not only NGOs, but it was on the part of the government. In terms of the quota and relocation program, which I do agree with the comment that was made, there is a need for a more coherent framework for legal channels. So not only looking at the Dublin reform and looking at asylum seekers and refugee status, but also different form of legal channels, either the guest workers, which I would be more critical about the Canadian example in another session, but to have a system of visas, to use different legal channels and leverage in order to prevent migrants to undertake those risky journeys, and we all know it. So this is often advocated for, but it's important to repeat it.
Very briefly, on solidarity, has already been said, is a legal obligation. I don't think it's a question of putting limit for whatever reason, including security. Also because I don't think the two things are in contradiction. It's not that you are, if you show solidarity, then you put anything or anybody at risk. The two things can go together, I guess. When your neighbor house is on fire, you're not going to count how many blankets you have and whether you can give what you have or not. You just go ahead and do it. We don't have time to get into some of the issues that have been raised. Yes, of course, there are a lot of African countries that are corrupted. From where we stand in Europe and the country I also come from, I don't think we can really give that many lessons to other parts of the world as to how much corruption is there. I also think that if we want to look at very recent history and we want to discuss how come DRC is in the situation it is, and we should look at who has been in charge for 30 years, who put it there, who kept it there, and who wanted to keep a corrupted kleptocratic government in place that has now created a situation that half of Africa is suffering from, and as a result also a large part of Europe is suffering from. So we cannot get into that, unfortunately, but just to say, according to Eurostat, within 15 to 20 years, the European labor market will suffer from a shortfall of about 60 million workers. Which, fun enough, 60 million, the size of a large country. They have to come from somewhere, which is also one of the reasons why every single national bank, including the UK, fun enough again, keep saying that migrant workers are from outside the EU membership are a must and are absolutely needed in terms of keeping our system alive. As of today, according to the latest official statistics, about 600,000 Italian retirees have their pension paid thanks to the contribution the migrants have made to the social security system over the past years. So no, it's not true that if we receive migrants and refugees, we are going to be in trouble with unemployment. First of all, unemployment has existed from far before the last wave of arrival in the last 3 years. And actually, migrants have shown to contribute to a positive solution of this problem. In fact, again, official number says that contribution of migrants to European GDP is estimated as of today at 8%, which is not negligible. Relocation and Dublin recast. There is no alternative to a mandatory relocation system for 2 reasons. The first, because we have had a voluntary relocation system until now, and it hasn't worked. So obviously it doesn't work. And because I agree, solidarity is a legal obligation. You are part of a union, you take responsibility, or as unpopular as it might sound, or you live. But if you are in the union, you take responsibility. If you are a member of a tennis club, you have to pay your dues. It's not that you decide if you pay or not. If you don't pay, you don't play. It's as simple as that. In terms of enforcing refugees to go to some country, I don't think it's a question of forcing them. It's a question of being a union also in terms of the system you have in place to receive refugees, either resettlement or relocation. If in a country you get one thing and in another country you get 10 things, obviously refugees will not go to country A but will go to country B. But if what you receive in terms of type of assistance, not in terms of quantity, but in type of assistance, is comparable across, then there will not be that much different. We are seeing in the relocation program that we implement out of Italy and Greece that refugees have not had any problem in going to Germany or Latvia or Estonia or Portugal, not at all. But it's a question of what you can offer them, and it's a question of how you explain to them what it is that they are getting into. Thank you.
So I have less than half minute.
My colleague holding up and now.
Okay, I'll try to be as brief as possible. First of all, the EU-Turkey statement, yes, it holds. It continues to deliver tangible results. The average arrivals are around 76 per day. Resettlements are around 5,000 till now. Out of the 2.2 billion, 1.5 has already been contracted. There's a steady progress on projects for education and health of Syrian refugees in Turkey. As far as the overall relations, yes, we continue to have this comprehensive and principled approach to West Turkey, while at the same time we're expressing our concerns regarding the internal situation. Second, as far as the demographic issue, picking up on the comments of Eugenio, which I fully share, migration is indeed a fact of life, and I think that the key challenge for the EU in the coming years is how it can turn this challenge into a big opportunity. On the solidarity question, from an external point of view, what is key is that EU and the member states speak with one voice towards third countries, and on a global level, the solidarity among the international, between the international global responsibility sharing at international level. And picking up again on the question on development, development money, let's be frank, it will never be enough. So that's why bringing the private sector is key. And this is why we're looking very much forward to the implementation of the external investment plan, where there's this joint venture between the public and the private sector. And as I have already stressed, what is key is that also the third countries proceed to the necessary structural changes so that they can combat the push factors that are pushing people to flee, which is abuse of human rights, lack of good governance, lack of economic and social development.
Thank you very much all. Thank you all for staying with us. I think we've tentatively answered some questions, perhaps raised more questions, and we can talk over the very short break until the next session. Thank you very much.
The title of the next session will be Towards the People's Europe, What Role for Parliament in Coming Decades. So for those who registered for this session, please remain seated, and otherwise leave the room and go to the refectory or wherever you're supposed to go. Thank you.
This was a good discussion today, but she unfortunately couldn't make it due to last-minute changes in her agenda in Brussels. So she sends her greetings and best wishes and hopes we enjoy the discussion. We are here today in a panel that is the outcome of a cooperation between the European Parliament and the European University Institute, and we are both very happy about that, both institutions. We do collaborate on different aspects, on projects that we do jointly and where we do mutually beneficial exchange on, joint publications and also joint events like this one that we have today to enhance the visibility of our work and of our research in each other's environments and communities. So I hope you will enjoy this cooperation that we have today. I'm going to briefly introduce the speakers to you and then frame a bit the panel to see where we stand now, to bring a bit in the voice of the people also here in our panel, because at this prominent time and moment in European politics, I think it's good to frame it a bit in a way to understand what people currently think of the European Union. So I'm happy to welcome the panel speakers of today that are all renowned experts on European politics, on the European Union, and on European parliaments. On my left-hand side, I start with Heather Grabby, who is the director of the Open Society European Policy Institute in Brussels and the director of EU Affairs over there as well. Previously, she was engaged in the institutional side of Brussels, as well as she was senior and special advisor to Olli Rehn in the enlargement negotiations. And I personally came across her work for the first time when she worked on enlargement and Europeanization and wrote about that. Before her position at the Open Society European Policy Institute, she was Deputy Director of the Center for European Reforms. She currently works on open society values and how to reconnect those with the European political system and how to bring them in. Bridget Leffen, Director of the Robert Schuman Center for Advanced Studies here at the EOI and Director of the Global Governance Program, under which I have the pleasure to work for 5 years as well. She was previously Professor for European Politics at the University College of Dublin, and which makes her contribution very interesting for our discussion today. She was also sharing the campaign in the second referendum, the second Irish referendum on the Nice Treaty.
And Lisbon.
And Lisbon. So on civic society involvement, I think she's the one to present her insight from the academic and the personal experience side. She has extensively worked on EU politics, Ireland, governance of the Eurozone, and geopolitical aspects of the European Union. Andreas Maurer. I actually now realize that I have personal connections more or less to everyone on the panel, which is good. He was my colleague for some 4 to 5 years at the University of Cologne. He's currently a professor in Jean Monnet Chair in European Integration Studies at the University of Innsbruck. And to my reading, one of the most renowned experts on European parliamentary and on parliamentarism, parliamentary studies and on parliamentarism that we have in Europe. Before taking up the engagement at the University of Innsbruck, he was head of the European office of the Stiftung Wissenschaft und Politik, one of the major think tanks in Germany, and before that also head of the research group on European integration and European foreign relations. Currently, his focus is on multi-level parliamentarism and parliamentary cooperation, and he will talk a bit about the parliamentary engagement in international trade agreement negotiations. On my right side, to round up the panel, is Anthony Teasdale, Director General of the European Parliamentary Research Service, in which I'm currently working, and he's also visiting Senior Fellow of the European Institute at the LSE. He had In his professional career, several positions in the British government, the European Parliament and also the Council, special advisor positions and positions as director of internal EU policy in the Parliament and also in the cabinet of Mr. Pöttering and Mr. Buzek. His research focus lies on subsidiarity studies, majority voting studies, elections, and with a view of history of European integration, also on the Luxembourg Compromise. So my idea to bring us in the mood of talking about increasing participation and representation in Europe was to present you insights from the latest study. Could we maybe just switch? Okay. This is now the actual thing that you always want to avoid. That you always want to avoid during panels. And there's nothing more painful than not being able to do that. Okay, here we are. Yeah. If it opens, this would be wonderful. Here we are. So, sorry for that. To present you some insights into a special Eurobarometer that was issued by the Parliament last week. And it's a midterm perspective on where do we stand with the perception of people on European integration and on EU institutions. And this is really just a quick run through the data. Nothing that I want to elaborate on, just to bring you in the mood. So, do people perceive that we have enough uniting elements in Europe to bring us together? So is there solidarity? Do we think there's something of belonging together? And as you see, we do have over 70%, 74% of people that indeed believe we do have more that unites us than that separates us. And I think it's quite a good basis to understand that there is a good fundament to develop the system further because people really believe it's worth it and we belong together. Next thing, do they still approve of EU membership? And interestingly, we are close to pre-crisis level in 2007 with this stock taking that was done in March 2017. So 57% believe that their country's membership in the EU is a good thing. Satisfaction with EU democracy. We were always split, so less than 50% of the population were always unsatisfied or satisfied with the EU democracy. So there is potential, as you see, and we do have a slight increase in dissatisfaction as compared to last year. It's 47% that are not satisfied with the way our democracy at EU level functions. On the other hand, do you think your voice counts within the EU? And people do so. It's interesting to see they are unsatisfied with how the union works, but nevertheless, they think we are heard. The system is responsive, 63%. So there is room for improvement. This is something that parliaments can take up and have to take up to make improvements because people are interested and willing. Something that I find for our panel very interesting is to see how best to make your voice heard. How do you think, which institutions are best to contact, right? People, 59% of those asked in the survey think European elections is my key access point to make my voice heard in the system. On top of that, writing to MEPs with 70%, ranging at the same level like the European Citizen Initiative. So the parliaments offer an access point, and the European Parliament offers an access point for participation within the system. Trajectories, do you think you will be more involved in EU politics in 2030 or not? Declining confidence as compared to 2013. We only see 35% confident that there will be changes in participatory structures, so in a way as to make me more engaged in EU politics and my voice heard. And as I like to take it as the positive view on that, there is potential because people, as you see, just for the basis of our discussion, we have the feeling of belonging together. EU membership is a good thing. Democracy can be improved. I am able to influence the system, to be involved in the system. EP elections are a good thing. So we are here with this slight bias in between. I think I am involved in the system, but I'm not yet there. And this is something that I think is the basis for where we are now to discuss, to see what roles can parliaments play to close this gap, to bring people closer to policy making within the EU and the member states, to increase representation, participation, to make the best of civil engagement. And on that basis, Heather, I think you might start with your ideas on representation, participation, and how to change maybe the gaps in the system that we have.
Thank you very much, Gavi, and very nice to be with you all this afternoon. I'm going to start off the panel discussion with some thoughts on why there is a crisis of representative democracy and ways that parliaments could respond to that. After a large-scale debate starting in the 1990s in particular about participation in politics, there's been increasing attention in recent years to the issue of representation. A number of books appearing with titles like The End of Representative Democracy, for example. And it's important to look at what are the reasons behind this. Often press coverage of these kinds of things points to scandals about corruption, for example, the expenses of deputies, or issues like methods of choosing candidates, for example, party lists versus constituencies and so on. But there are also some very fundamental trends which are part of the way in which life is changing for voters, which also affect parliaments. And so these are what you could argue are rather longer term and issues really affecting the whole of societies. I've been doing some work with Jamie Bartlett at Demos, a UK think tank, on the way in which technology in particular has changed people's expectations of politics. So I'm going to talk about changes in expectations, changes in affiliation, in location, and in information, and then what to do about that. So the first one is that parliaments are relying on a political technology developed in the 19th century. It's votes every 4, 5, 6 years, and they, of course, are relying on parties as the main way of organising parliamentary debate and representation of interests. But the thing is, voters in their daily lives as consumers and employees and parents and the other sides of their identity when they're not voting have a very different experience of technology. As consumers, they experience online life as being instant, transparent, easy, and connected. When they're on Amazon or on eBay or on Facebook, they have a completely different experience from what they get when they're voting. Politics, on the other hand, as they see it, and it really is, it's often slow, it's laborious, it's inevitably secretive at some level, it's complex. And of course, at EU level, it's more complex still, which of course makes the problem more intense. It's very hard for citizens to follow what's going on. And there isn't the sense of interaction that they have with online life in general. You know, if you don't like a product on Amazon, you can post a comment about it, and you can get dozens of responses overnight as to whether people agree with you. Much harder to do that in your opinions about your deputy, for example. By deputy, I mean your MP, your member of parliament. So the first challenge is, how can politics meet people's new expectations about decision making, which are derived from other spheres of their lives and which are on a different kind of technology? The second one is affiliation. The model of mass membership political parties is losing support, at least in its current form. Across Europe, formal party membership is dwindling in most countries. An example from a country I know well is in the UK, until the recent uptick because of the change in the way that the Labour Party recruited members, all of the major political parties combined had a membership of less than membership of the National Trust, which is a stately home charity. So, and in many countries, Germany's a bit of an exception because of the way that the tax system works, but in many countries, the party membership has fallen off a cliff. People just don't join parties. But they're very interested in new forms of affiliation, especially through social media and alternative networks. Digital technology allows people to find myriad new ways to express their political views publicly outside of formal political spaces. Every day they see millions of conversations about political issues in new digital spaces. Twitter is the obvious one, Facebook news feeds, comment threads, blogs, videos. And this forms a new digital commons that reflects the hopes and views and beliefs of citizens, but it's not necessarily easy to connect these new debates to formal political engagement. Political institutions tend to expect voters to come to them, but then websites are not where the action is. So how can you take political issues to the places where there is already hot debate about them? And this is especially challenging for parliaments, which used to have a monopoly on being the location of discussion. I think it's especially challenging for the European Parliament, which was set up to debate laws and under the Lisbon Treaty was of course given more powers as a co-legislator. But of course there's less legislation than there used to be in the European Union. So how do you get beyond that? And of course we see the way there's been a turbo boost to debates moving to other fora with political leaders like Donald Trump communicating directly to voters by Twitter over the heads of Congress. There's this direct connection with political leaders that makes affiliation and location all the more complicated. And then finally, there are the new sources and types of information. The internet makes vast amounts of data available and a huge range of information sources, and that affects engagement with politics. It changes the nature of political reporting and journalism, makes it far more dynamic and pluralistic. And it means that it's harder for parliamentarians to claim to have special knowledge and expertise about topics to the public, when the public might be getting a quite different narrative from Al Jazeera or Russia Today about, for example, even a complex foreign policy issue like Syria. So it's how can you keep political reporting accurate and pluralistic so that voters get reliable information on which to make political choices between who to vote for in terms of parliamentary representation? How do you ensure that voters, representatives and institutions are not overwhelmed with data and simply switch off? Now, each of these major changes is both an opportunity and a challenge. And of course, by realizing what the nature of the changes and the extent of them, that's the first step towards changing politics to meet the expectations of voters. I did a paper recently on the opportunities for digital politics to re-engage voters, which looked specifically at Twitter as a very interesting way of communicating with voters. And the study that I did with Jamie Bartlett at Demos really looked at how MEPs have used Twitter around the 2014 European Parliament elections and discovered that they use it for very different purposes. To give you just a thumbnail of the findings, we basically monitored the whole of all tweets sent to or by MEPs during the months before the European Parliament elections 2014. Not surprisingly, the populist parties, the new and more extreme parties standing for election, use Twitter much more than the mainstream parties. But also, they use it in a different way. They don't just use it to promote press releases and to broadcast their message to voters. They use it interactively. Take an MEP like Nigel Farage, incredibly effective at using conversations with voters, getting a comment and then replying to it, to broadcast his message and to replicate it, to get people not only to retweet what he says, but to retweet their own comments and make it look as if he's actually far more engaged with the public than other MEPs who are actually in the chamber a good deal more often. So it's important to look at how MPs and MEPs actually use things like Twitter. But an example of a more mainstream MEP who's extremely effective at using Twitter on serious policy issues is Marietje Schaake, who's a Dutch liberal, who has been, she's pioneered the crowdsourcing of amendments to European Parliament legislation. She also tweets her manifesto in 10 tweets out to a huge, and I think she has the largest number of social media following after Nigel Farage in the European Parliament. So there's some very interesting research that results to show, and there's a lot more research to be done on this. But in brief, there are plenty of things that can be done. One is to use online platforms to facilitate dialogue about legislative proposals and their implications, including deliberation in committees. There are plenty of web tools that could enhance the presentation of diverse views and considerations. And those could help to make deliberation on legislation a lot more interactive and re-engage voters in discussion of laws. Laws and policies still really matter, and therefore legislatures really matter. But you have to show the public, which is overloaded, bombarded with information, why it matters to them and how they can get involved. In terms of affiliation, it's actually, technology also offers opportunities to identify issues that are important to citizens but have been overlooked in political processes. So you can search very wide scale by using big data. And finally, you can also engage citizens by creating data dashboards freely available to MEPs or MPs to allow them to make sense of the new digital commons. That would help to elected representatives to collect and analyze online conversations, but it also allows them to interest citizens in matters that will affect them, but which they may not realize affect them. I think Brexit is a very good example of this, for example. So there are plenty of ways of doing this. The question is it possible to match up the 19th century technology of elections every 5 years with a single vote with 21st century methods of using information and location of debates? So I'm looking forward to hearing what the other panelists think about how we could do that.
Thank you very much, Heather, which brings us also to the central question of adapting these 19th century political structures to 21st century demands for participation and representation, which are quite interesting, and which leads us directly to Bridget, who will elaborate on that.
Thank you very much. I've never quite realized what it is to be a judge wafting over an audience like this, but I've never sat on a panel that's been so elevated in terms of the audience in my entire academic career. But that said, we're not judges, we're participants. This morning I chaired a session on referendums, the quintessential instrument of direct democracy, and this afternoon we talk about parliaments, the arena of representative democracy. And both referendums and parliaments, parliamentary elections, are the two key means of mass participation. And of course, referendums are once off, although they leave extraordinary legacies and have consequence, and parliamentary elections come round at intervals depending on the stability of government. So I thought my contribution this afternoon would look to other institutional devices that may link citizens to key issues of public policy and politics, in addition to referendums and parliamentary elections. And what I want to talk about are citizens' assemblies. These are institutional devices that can be used between elections. In addition to elections, they can be mandated by parliaments, but they are means of bringing citizens in, not just to the routine calendar of politics. What characterizes citizens' assemblies? They tend to be, in terms of numbers, rather small, between 50 and 100 citizens, randomly chosen. The citizens are supposed to be representative of the electorate that they represent. They tend to be time-bound and issue-driven. In other words, a citizens' assembly is convened for a purpose, it conducts that purpose, and then it ends its life. There have been many examples of citizens' assemblies, beginning in the 2000s in two in Canada, Ontario and British Columbia, and the question was electoral reform. And having gone through an exercise of deliberation and recommendation, in fact, in both cases, it did not end up in a change in the electoral system, because in one case the threshold wasn't arrived at, and in another it was defeated. In the Netherlands, there was also one, 2006, on electoral reform, and here the recommendation was sent to Parliament and passed by Parliament. It was not as a result. It was not linked to direct democracy. I had in 2011 a very direct experience of designing something like this. I was part of a small group of Irish citizens who were, in early 2011, having experienced the arrival of the Troika in November 2010, and one can only understand what it is like to live in a society that the IMF, ECB and Commission arrive in when you go through it. It is quite a distinctive experience because you suddenly realize that the stability and foundations of your system of public policy, and in our case our financial system, were really creaking. In other words, there was a palpable sense in the society that something was really wrong. And a group of us got together and asked, well, you know, can we let this roll over us, or is there something that could be done? And I had a colleague who was very interested in Citizens' Assembly, and one day we sat round, as one does as an academic, having too much coffee, and we thought, okay, we're going to do it. And our purpose was to road test a model that we would then persuade the Irish government to take on and do something with. So what did we do? We firstly raised enough money to be able to do this. It didn't require a lot. And then we engaged in 7 regional events all over the country, which culminated in a citizens' assembly in Dublin at the end. So 2 very intense months. And the questions were put. One other thing I should say about Citizens' Assembly is that they're clearly designed to be deliberative forums, but also there are different points of view, resources, and expertises used in order to sketch out the issues. So the Citizens' Assembly met, and it was also an academic research exercise in that those who attended were polled. There was control groups, etc., etc. So what did we learn from this exercise? Firstly, we learned that the model could work in Ireland. Secondly, we learned that everyone involved were more interested in politics at the end, felt more involved in politics, were much more positive about the ability of ordinary people to do politics, to have a view, and remember this was the worst of times. They were much more sympathetic towards parliamentarians. That for me was in a sense, they suddenly realized how tough it is to grapple with tough issues. And then so they were asked, what did you get from this in terms of the actual issues? And the answer was the complexity of trade-off. And of course, so much public policy is about the complexities of trade-offs. So these were a group randomly chosen. We didn't make any of the selections. It was outsourced properly. So there was a report that then went to the Irish government of the time, and the Irish government, to our surprise, decided it had in the government, the programme for government had a big agenda on political reform, and the government decided to set up a constitutional convention in 2011-12. They didn't quite buy the Citizens' Assembly. They had 33 parliamentarians and 67 citizens. You really couldn't let the citizens do this on their own. There had to be parliamentarians. That met over 2 years, dealt with issues of some very important issues and others that were not, including, there were some of them that were really trivial, but this was the government's way of testing how to do this. But there was one really important outcome that changed Irish politics and Ireland, and that was that this constitutional convention voted overwhelmingly for marriage equality. And had this constitutional convention not done this, no Irish government would have had a marriage equality referendum, which was overwhelmingly carried. So Ireland was changed through the constitutional convention. interestingly, there's another one now, and it has tackled another very difficult issue in Ireland, abortion. And 87% of the Citizens' Assembly have voted to change, repeal the 8th Amendment of the Irish Constitution and voted to change. And there will be a referendum. So these are two very significant ways in which an institutional design that involved citizens will alter politics. And it was a very interesting, it really was deliberative, and in the case of marriage equality, transformative. So even if the Citizens' Assembly did nothing else, that in and of itself was worth the exercise. So then one has to think about, and here I stop, how can this be, could this be translated into a European environment? It's of course much more complicated because in a European environment you have the cross-national, the language, etc., etc. But it shouldn't be beyond institutional design and resources of the EU to also begin to experiment. I know that there was a deliberative polling exercise in the European Parliament back in 2007, but I think we also need to get imaginative about different institutional designs that don't substitute for referendums or parliaments or elections, but add to the texture of citizen involvement and the opportunities. So experimentation, in my view, is absolutely necessary, and particularly, as Heather said, given the technological communications revolution that we live in. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Bridget. That very much centers around discussions we had previously about how to adapt and change political processes at national and European level based on governance, democracy, open source software, where we do see deliberation going on in experimental ways, and where smaller groups try to indeed advance the participation process by bringing in elements of those. We are now turning to Andreas, who's giving us insight in institutional and interinstitutional aspects of the future role of parliaments and of the current role of parliaments, focusing on trade agreement negotiations.
Thank you very much. Thank you also very much for the invitation, giving the opportunity to share with you some of my more recent ideas about how we can translate our knowledge and empirical findings on parliamentary scrutiny, both at the European Parliament national level, into an area with which we have not dealt with so far. And we know a lot about the early warning mechanism, red cards, orange cards, yellow cards, green cards, how and why national parliaments interfere and participate, under which conditions on the European Parliament, that's clear. My concern is more on an area where it's rather fresh for both sides of parliaments, and where both sides of parliaments are likely to antagonize and not to cooperate, and that's the area of international agreements. Of course, basically international trade agreements that are the examples, but I think one can widen the argument to all, let's say, all aspects of the EU's non-military foreign policies, so international agreements as such. The argument is basically, starting assumption is parliamentary scrutiny of government, or if you look at the European Union, European Council, Commission, not government, but the collective governative largely depends on information about the letter's execution of power, or intended execution of power, which also then is translated into the argument that parliamentary legitimacy of the EU policymaking largely depends on, that we know a lot about, the scope of information, the timing and management of information, the treatment of information, the impact of the parliamentary treatment of information vis-à-vis the government or the executive branches of government, the understanding by parliaments of what they mean by scrutiny, involvement, participation, because it's not the same. And what we have also heard in the first session this morning, of course, the politicization, the salience, the polarization of EU affairs within parliaments and the wider public. That's widely accepted. I mean, if parliaments are not informed, if parliament do not get access to information, they have a problem. I mean, you can have a very nice designed system for parliamentary scrutiny and early warnings and so on. If parliaments do not have something to to deal with. They have a problem. So my second starting point is to look at the conditions of access to documents, and if we look at international agreements, not only documents as such, but those documents where, say, the agents or the executive declares documents as being confidential, restreint, confidential, in NATO, cosmic, I don't know what else. There is no specific rule for parliaments on that in the EU treaty, interesting enough. But there is, at least since the Lisbon Treaty, in the Charter on Fundamental Rights, a constitutional or a fundamental right to access of documents which is granted to all citizens. And when members of parliament are citizens of the European Union, that is, I mean, baseline for Heidi Hautala and Sophie in 't Veld. When they claim their access to documents, they also always have to say, well, we are also usual citizens of the European Union, and therefore we want to have access to these documents. That right of access of documents is there, and it's challenged by the Council. Now, in an ideal world, interparliamentary cooperation in the areas which are not international trade basically work like that. At the vertical level, you have different phases of the policy cycle of the European Union, starting from the preparation of a piece of legislation up to the control or the implementation and control of a piece of legislation. Then we have two circles. You can widen that to regional parliaments, but let's stake it for at these two levels of parliaments: a European Parliament sphere of participation, national parliament sphere of participation, and in the middle, where there is an overlap, possibilities, or let's say opportunity structures for interparliamentary cooperation, for compensating the lack of information, of documents at a given phase or step in the scrutiny process. That's the ideal world. It worked very nicely when parliaments were concerned with the creation of the Schengen Agreement. It was basically a little bit the same as parliaments have realized when CETA and TTIP was negotiated. Some parliaments, European parliaments, the French Senate and the Dutch Tweede Kamer, realized that there are things going on which their governments do not inform them on, where the Commission could not inform the European Parliament because the European Commission was out of the creation of Schengen, where member states didn't inform the European Parliament because they didn't have any interest to do so, where the Council could not inform the European Parliament because the Council, as a collective body of the European Union, was not involved in the Schengen Agreement. Then the European Parliament invited all committees, home and judicial affairs, legal affairs, what existed, and say, well, let's exchange our views. Let's exchange what we know about what's going on in this Schengen Agreement. And what I meant by a nice cooperation, a working cooperation, was that the Dutch members of Parliament and the French members of the French Senate shared their information about the ongoing negotiations on Schengen with all the other parliamentarians. There was not so much concern about what is confidential or not confidential. I mean, it was not even flagged as confidential. But they shared the information, and they had this possibility to, throughout the negotiation of the Schengen Agreement and Schengen II, national parliaments, which originally would have no access to any kind of document leading to the Schengen Agreement, had a possibility to voice their opinion towards the government on the basis of information they've got from other parliaments. So if that worked in Schengen, perhaps it could also work in international trade agreements. And that is a big problem, because the puzzle beyond our concerns about early warning and so on is we have a lot of articles in the Treaty on European Union and the TFEU which grants not only the European Parliament but also the national parliaments which a lot of access points. And we believed for a long time, until the fiscal compact at least, that the issue of the scope of information has been solved. They say, well, the treaty now says the European Commission, all other institutions, have to provide national parliaments directly, immediately with their documents, with white papers, green papers, and so on. But there are exclusions, and these exclusions, parliaments started to realize the exclusions only very lately. CFSP, CSDP, the Fiscal Compact, or all these self-declared core groups, trade, OMC policies still continue to escape parliamentary control, not only at the European Parliament level, but also at the national parliament level. Secondly, and that is a problem not for national parliaments, or not for most of national parliaments, but for the European Parliament, unlike most of the EU member states where the comprehensive rules on parliamentary access to documents and the restriction and the reasons why there is a restriction on access to documents, why there are classified documents, are based on parliamentary laws or presidential regulations. The European Parliament's access to documents of the Commission and the Council is a matter of non-legislative rules, and the European Parliament is not the master of the game, which leads me to the central hypothesis saying limiting parliamentary access to documents, to confidential documents, as a fundamental act of parliamentary self-restraint, and thus reflecting parliamentary sovereignty and self-determination. Now, in the last 2 minutes, just to end up with some open questions on that, if we look on how parliaments, both levels of parliaments, dealt with in the last years, starting with the Korea Agreement, where European Parliament acted, national parliaments were silent. ACTA, where both levels of parliaments became very active, very responsive to citizens' concerns when we speak about representativity. TTIP, TISA, CETA, where the European Parliament had a lot of access to documents via the framework agreement of the European Commission and then lately an agreement with the Council, national parliaments reacted very quickly, very lately. And only when citizens, NGOs, ganged up against these treaties and these contracts. That leads me to some conclusions where I'm not clear, but if they will hold if we test them empirically. But just to put them to the floor. First, the national parliaments, if we look at, let's say, remain at TTIP and CETA, ACTA. National parliaments seem to be much more responsive to civil society than they were before. They are responsive. I mean, it might be frustrating for some people in Brussels to see that national parliaments remain extremely quiet throughout the negotiation process. And when it comes to the end of the negotiation process, national parliaments become extremely active, very negative, and claim against ACTA, Poland, same, or against CETA, Austrian Nationalrat, and so on. But at the same time, national parliaments side with the perception that the EU antagonizes member states. And that is a big problem, because when national parliaments start to antagonize themselves against the European Union, they provide a vision towards the European citizenry that Brussels or the EU is some kind of an imaginative 28-member state, or even not a member state, but a strange alien Leviathan against which themselves they have to secure the citizens against it. And then we enter into this starting assumption about the antagonization and the hypocrisy which is going on there, because most national parliaments know very well via their governments that isn't true. Many of the national parliaments have via their governments wide access even to confidential documents about the trade agreements. That's the open questions, and how far do we deal in future with the fact that maybe citizens might think that national parliaments provide more legitimacy towards EU policymaking in that area, but they do that because they lie about the nature in the EU's legislative process. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Andreas. Interesting to open the mind to that dimension of interinstitutional issues, that not only the Parliament versus the other institutions within the EU system is something to look at when we study the action and interaction of parliaments, but also the antagonist situation, European supranational level and national levels. We're concluding the panel now and then open up to the floor with Anthony's insight, maybe also into questions of how to increase transparency, accountability in the interinstitutional daily work of the Parliament.
Thank you very much, and thank you very much indeed, Gabi, for that introduction, and thank you also to the other panelists for a terrific presentation of these different dimensions. The last time I think I'm right in saying that the last time I was in this room here, the Teatro, was in the 1980s. The EUI at that stage, I was a young postgraduate student at the time, the EUI at that time used to organize a great event, which was an annual summer school in comparative European politics. I don't think it's any longer provided, which is a pity. And we shared the insights of a variety of leading political scientists from all over Europe at the time, orchestrated by Hans Dalder. And I remember two of the principal themes that we discussed were one rather well-established hobby horse in political science, namely the decline of parliaments, and a completely new phenomenon which appeared to be hitting the stage, which was the decline of political parties. And at that time, I would say that they were seen, and decline of political parties, we have to put it in perspective, was nothing compared with what we've seen subsequently. I mean, in 1981, for example, in the French presidential election at that time, you had a situation where the four main political parties, which were effectively two bloc coalitions, got between them over 85% of the vote in the presidential election, and the turnout in both the first and second ballots was over 80%. So we're talking about a time in which alignment, in which party membership, in which the organization of political parties and so on was much, much more solid than it is today. But the general view at that time was that these two phenomena, the decline of parties and the decline of parliaments, might be interlinked, and that the decline of political parties might re-empower parliaments in some way. They might give the opportunity to reverse the logic of what had happened throughout the 20th century, in which parliaments had been increasingly dominated by single party or multi-party coalition governments which effectively could rely upon the disciplined support of their members in delivering manifesto commitments in which the public would make clear choices between alternative views of society. I think it's now clear with the benefit of hindsight that we can see that the relative strengths of parliaments and of political parties were not inversely related, and that the decline of political parties has not led primarily, if at all, to the resurgence of parliaments, certainly not at national level. And these two declines appear to have continued in parallel. So I think it's an important and interesting question to ask why. Heather touched a little bit on some of these phenomena, I think, which are driving it, but I'd like, if I may, just to say a few words about it. Party de-alignment has gone hand in hand not only with the desire for a wider and freer choice between parties and indeed within parties to choose leaders and candidates, but with a much broader political disaffection and disillusionment on the part of electors who do not see, I think, political parties and parliaments any longer as rival sources of legitimacy within a political system, with one stepping up to fill the gap perhaps if the other declines, but rather they are increasingly seen as jointly parts of a political system that favors insiders over outsiders, that's part of an alienated superstructure, seeing them as parallel and interlinked vehicles for the selection, the operation, and the survival of a self-contained political class. And we have to address this issue directly if we're going to see serious prospects of parliaments being revived as key fora for democratic political debate. Now, of course, compounding the fracturing of the electorate over time has been the empowerment of the individual in society as a consumer, including as an individual consumer of politics, a process which the digital revolution, of course, is taking forward at increasing speed. It follows that unless parliaments can find ways of speaking to, of channeling, of organizing and responding to these new political voices and fora in which those voices are expressed, to align themselves more closely to citizens' interests and concerns, the gap or the vacuum which has been left by the decline of parties will not be filled by parliaments, but by other fora or democratic discussion and the holding, other fora for democratic discussion and for holding governments to account. Now, so far, I would say that the responses of parliaments to this challenge have been rather traditional. It's fascinating to hear what Heather was saying about crowdsourcing of amendments, about the tweeting out of manifesto points, about Twitter conversations by individual members, and all of this is happening. But at an institutional level, the platforms that have been created are much more conventional. A stronger access point granted, greater use of petitions, greater electronic fora for receiving and collecting people's views. And this is all obviously to be welcomed, but there is a significant risk in this of raising false expectations if people's views are not then taken up or indeed even acknowledged. And I think looking at it from the point of view of a citizen, rather than as a political scientist or an administrator or part of the political class, it's important to realize this, that people expect some action in response to the communication which is being made to those people who elect them. I mean, if I take my own personal example of this, I've 3 times communicated with my local MP in London about an important public policy issue, and each time I receive an electronic message which tells me that even as a constituent, I should not expect her to reply to any views which are being expressed on current public policy issues, because it's simply impossible, given the volume of communication being received, to address a constituent in that way. And I would certainly say, as a private individual, my view of that Member of Parliament has significantly declined as a result of that experience. In other words, the interaction process has personally alienated me from the political process, even though I'm somebody who's worked in and has experienced the political process very close up for most of my adult life. A second way in which parliaments have been attempting to respond is by strengthening oversight and scrutiny of the executive with stronger committees and independent sources of research and advice. And in my own work in the European Parliament, our Parliamentary Research Service has been doing quite a lot to try to support members both individually and collectively in this field of scrutiny, helping, we hope, to empower them through knowledge. But the problem, I think, is that although greater scrutiny of the executive may lead to better prepared, better justified public policy choices and greater attention to the effectiveness of outcomes, all of which clearly is a public good, it can too easily be seen as a kind of technocratic discussion among insiders within the system, rather than something which provides an easy transmission mechanism to outsiders and with their concerns. A third way, and I know it was touched on this morning in the session, unfortunately, which I couldn't attend, that parliaments, or the governments and parties that control them, have sometimes chosen to respond, is sharing their formal power with the public, notably by use of the referendum on European issues. But the irony here is that if the public takes a position which is different from the majority view in the Parliament, as happened notably in Britain recently, the government will be under strong pressure, perhaps irresistible pressure, to choose the view of the people over the view that was previously that of the Parliament, so reducing the authority of the latter. In Britain, a referendum was held in the name of parliamentary sovereignty, but its effect in practice was to assert a new, higher sovereignty, namely the sovereignty of the people. And the consequence was that pretty much for the first time in British political history, we had a government pursuing a major policy which a majority of the lower chamber of Parliament had opposed. And that was inherently an unsustainable position. And it was an important factor, I think, why Theresa May recently decided to call an early general election. So what's needed in response by parliaments is something more radical, I think, than what's been tried so far. We've heard examples of how individual members are taking the lead in doing that, and the institutional structure of parliaments hopefully can support them in that process. But fundamentally what's required, I think, and I'm speaking here, it's my personal view, is that the nature of being a member of parliament has to change. That instead of members of parliament thinking of themselves as essentially bound by the strictures of party, they have to break free from that and see themselves as entrepreneurial political figures in their own right who are prepared to assert against party disciplines views that they wish to express or views which they want to take on board as a result of the representations that have been made by the general public. In other words, for the revival, perhaps even the survival of parliaments, the decline of parties may, in fact, ironically, need to go one stage further. And the political science community, amply represented, I think, in this hall, which has so far tended to lament the decline of parties as the same as the hollowing out of democracy, will need to embrace the new politics of the empowered citizen as an inevitable reflection, perhaps even a welcome reflection, of the modern interconnected society in which we live. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Anthony. Actually, especially what you said about the decline of political parties is something that might even go hand in hand with a stronger participation of citizens in online-based democratic tools that we will find and that we already find at municipal level in many cities when it comes to budget decisions. Very interesting idea, to be honest, very interesting idea. So I have the pleasure now to open up the panel with first comments of Ian Cooper, a Jean Monnet Fellow at the Robert Schuman Center and a researcher from the University of Cambridge as well, who has intensively worked on parliaments and who will give us some first reflection and ideas and questions to the panel. Thank you, Ian.
Thank you. This has been an extraordinarily rich and interesting panel. And in reflecting on all of the comments that have been made, I want to broaden out the conversation just a little bit further. And rather than asking individual questions to each of the panelists, I'll just throw out some ideas that everyone can comment on, if you like. If I'm just briefly a word about my own research, I do research on national parliaments in the European Union, specifically on the collective role of national parliaments in the political system of the European Union. So from their effect collectively on, constitutionally, on the European Union, and I have my idea is that national parliaments constitute a virtual third chamber. Briefly, I think the examples of this, if you look at the changing role of national parliaments, especially in the last 10 years and especially since the passage of the Treaty of Lisbon, there's been some quite dramatic changes. First of all, and some of them were mentioned, especially by Andreas. One has been, there's been a proliferation of interparliamentary meetings, interparliamentary conferences. There's the creation of an interparliamentary conference on CFSP in 2012, an interparliamentary conference on economic governance in 2013. And just this year, and this is brand new, this is news, just last month there was an agreement to create a joint parliamentary scrutiny group to oversee Europol, which would involve national parliamentarians and MEPs sitting together in a joint body exercising actual oversight over Europol. And that is something that is genuinely new because it would involve national parliaments in the structured permanent oversight of an EU agency. And then beyond the interparliamentary conferences, you have national parliaments involved in the early warning mechanism, which gives them the possibility of intervening in the EU's legislative system. Also, there is the so-called political dialogue, which is broader in scope, but also basically involves national parliaments in an extensive correspondence with the Commission on all matters of public policy. And additionally, I would add one more very important change in the role of national parliaments is that all national parliaments now have a representative in Brussels. And they all work together in the same suite of offices provided generously by the European Parliament. And so I would argue that these four things together give national parliamentarians or national parliaments a collective role in 4 ways: in oversight, legislation, deliberation, and representation. So I'd be curious to know whether, in thinking about the role of parliaments in the coming decades, whether the panelists would want to reflect on whether any of those changes are as important as I make them out to be, but also could they be developed? And then I would bring up 2 more questions in thinking about the role of national parliaments and the changing role of national parliaments. One would be about Brexit. How will Brexit affect parliaments? For one thing, how will Brexit affect the European Parliament? And one idea that is being floated around is the idea that the 73 MEP seats from the United Kingdom could actually be redistributed at a trans-European list, which would actually perhaps have an integrative function. Could be a bit of good news coming out of Brexit. And another question is, how would Brexit affect the role of national parliaments? And for example, Brexit has already affected the role of national parliaments because the idea of a red card, which was in the original deal between the EU and the UK prior to Brexit, that will not come to pass because that was voted down by the voters of Britain. So one question is, how will Brexit affect the position of parliaments within the EU? And another question, really broad, is there a role for some kind of new parliamentary body, such as a Eurozone parliament, which is an idea that has been endorsed by Emmanuel Macron, among others. If you're going to have a 2-speed Europe with a Eurozone, with a finance minister for the Eurozone, a treasury for the Eurozone, and a budget for the Eurozone, then don't you also need a Eurozone parliament in order to oversee that? So those are my questions for the panelists.
Perfect. Thank you very much, Ian. We're now opening up the floor to questions and then do 1 round of answers and then check if we have still time left for some further questions. So the first one, I have the gentleman in the first row, and I might invite you to present yourself shortly so that we know who you are. Thank you very much.
Yeah, hi, my name is Bunde, and I was a member of the European Parliament and gained a big victory in 2006 when Barroso came and promised from now on he would deliver all documents to the national parliaments before they started the deliberations in Brussels. But honestly, it's not a very strong success. Not because the Commission does not deliver, but because the parliaments are still not able to handle EU documents. And the very famous European Scrutiny Committee of Denmark is not as good as you may believe. We publish some figures next week in a new book I co-write with a professor. And last year there were 48 mandates, negotiating mandates, to 1,950 legal acts. They come together every Friday, they have a heavy agenda, and no one has read the related documents. Sorry, it's not possible to scrutinize that monster producing so many rules, except if you involve the sectoral committees. And our suggestion is that you should start the reading in every sectoral parliament in Europe. They should make a mandate in writing for the European Affairs Committee. They should then decide the mandate for the government, the negotiating mandate, and take the overall judgment, how many conflicts can we dare to cope with. And then they can make the final decision, which could then be decided upon electronically in the national parliament, so that you can, the gentleman from the press, can then go and look
he voted in favor of social justice or the opposite, and punish him on the next polling day. There's no other way, sorry. And no member of parliament will involve himself in reading the documents from Brussels, because the only thing he can gain from that is defeat in the next national elections. No one will praise him for what he realized, what the success he got. No one. But if there are trouble in the areas he touched, then he will be punished. So you need to make it a mandatory rule that they must sign or vote upon electronically what they ask the minister for to negotiate. Otherwise, it will never happen. And we have a good precedent for that in the European Parliament. When we established electronic voting, what happened? Every member of Parliament hired 2 free assistants to avoid that he was voting wrong. He could be killed by voting wrong. And then you got the involvement where the members of the European Parliament voted de facto, came and voted every day, 12 o'clock, and it was read in the electronic protocol how they had voted. It worked, and it only worked when this mandatory system was introduced. Then one thing on transparency, the only thing you need to do is to turn around on the procedure so that everything is open unless there's a qualified majority to close it. That was a proposal of the European Parliament for very many years. We had it in the convention. I collected signatures. Every single member of a parliament, every single elected member of the parliament signed. Every member from the European Parliament signed. All the governments except France, Germany, and the UK signed the amendment. Joschka Fischer wanted to sign, was not permitted by his Secretary of State. Villepin, Foreign Minister, wanted to sign, was not permitted. Peter Hain, the British, wanted to sign, was not permitted by Foreign Office. That is interesting, and I would like to have an explanation on that. Why is there a level about all the elected members of Parliament and all the responsible ministers deciding that we cannot have the documents they are discussing? Thank you.
Thank you very much. I have Marco, and then I'm turning to the other side.
Yes, I'm Marco Incerti from SEPS, a think tank in Brussels. And I have 2 questions. One is related to the point that Eder was making about using social media and new technologies to engage with citizens. Mercedes Bresso said this morning, already now technology would allow you to crowdsource amendments. Now, already in the current situation without technology, you have thousands of amendments literally for many pieces of legislation. Marietje Schaake, that you mentioned by herself, has 40,000 followers on Twitter. What happens if you add this multiplier factor? Like, how do you cope with millions of amendments? And will it not slow down the process too much? And the second question is stemming from something that Anthony said. I was very interested in hearing him say that basically in the future, parliamentarians will have to break away from the constraints of their mandate. And now again, in the context of Brexit, as you know, there was a very hot debate because of the triple whip that the Labour Party applied. I know several members of the British Parliament on the Labour side who had big problems because their intimate conviction was that you should vote Remain, you should vote against the government, but they had to respect the whip and their constituents' wishes. In the Parliament, one of the biggest, European Parliament, that is, one of the biggest achievements is the fact that the main groups, have strong party discipline. They vote 80–90% of the times coherently. So how do you reconcile this need for discipline and coherence and consistency with the need for parliamentarians to...
Thank you very much. I have 2 questions on the left-hand side.
I'm Günter Douwen, Secretary General of a European Political Foundation, the Center Maurits Kopieters. In the 15 years that I've been working for the European Free Alliance and the Center Maurits Kopieters, it struck me that the European institutions on the political level ignore a certain reality in the European Union, namely minorities, regional identity, stateless nations and emerging new states. we've been talking here about building a Europe of the peoples, but I haven't heard anything about the role of regional parliaments, for instance. And my question is academia, in the same way as the European institutions, turning a bit a blind eye to that particular important dimension in Europe, representing more or less, or ignoring more or less 80 to 100 million European citizens?
Thank you very much. And there in the back. And then we do a first round of answers, please.
I'm Hervé, and I'm a member of the Young European Federalists. And in March, we have organized a project, the European Youth Convention. And we have organized this project with 150 young citizens to write a constitution for the European Union. And I think also some MEPs or also some candidates, I think about Emmanuel Macron in France, also speak about citizen convention to rethink the European project. So what do you think about these initiatives or this proposition? And maybe can we think about citizen conventions in 2019 after the European election, maybe to relaunch the European project?
Thank you very much. I'm going to, is it short or? Yeah. So we're going to have a first round of answers, and I actually think that we start with you, Bridget, maybe on Brexit. In differentiation, impact of differentiation on the work of parliaments and on the feasibility of work of parliaments. And in terms of the proceeding of the panel, please the other panelists come in, because the discussion among us, I think, is quite interesting to exchange. Thank you.
Well, just in terms of the question on Brexit, it clearly offers an opportunity, a pot of seats that can be used to generate a transnational constituency. And if you look at politics in Europe today, the national trumps the European in political terms. So we get opportunities as political actors as citizens at domestic level for the most important elections. The European Parliament elections are second order. But there are a lot of people in Europe, I suspect, who would be interested in voting for people in a pan-European constituency. It is at least, it is something that's worth trying. I'm a great believer in experimentation in politics. And it would be interesting to see what its impact would be on party groups in terms of how it would work. So I think it's worth at least a shot. I would also add to that the direct election of the Commission President. I think that the Spitzenkandidaten is problematic because it draws the relationship between the Parliament, the European Parliament and the Commission too close. I think it would be much better to have an independently elected President of the Commission, answerable to the European Parliament, and at least one transnational constituency. It's an experiment worth making. On the Eurozone Parliament or subset parliaments, all that depends on what the Eurozone becomes.
Thank you very much. And what do you think about that?
Well, yeah, on the Eurozone Parliament, I think it tends to renationalize parliaments and the European Parliament. So if you build it inside the European Parliament, Macron, Schulz, Gabriel, you renationalize the European Parliament, you destabilize the political groups. I don't think that this would be a good idea, because then you duplicate structures. Again, today we have a duplication via the Council of Ministers and Committee of the Regions. If you look at Germany, Austria, Italy, and so on, they all say the same. In the end, it's governments, or even if they are in the second chamber, in the regional chamber, but they're sitting there as governments. So if you add the Eurozone Parliament, it's again a replication of what the government already said. Secondly, if you think the Eurozone from the end and not from today, The Eurozone is the European Union minus Denmark. So why should we create a specific parliament? I think for the Danes, Jens, say something on that, but I think the Danes silently accepted that they have something like the euro, they call it the Danish kroner. But they are completely dependent on what happens in the European Central Bank. So why should we create something to destabilize the European Union? I think what Macron has there in mind, and in Germany, Gabriel, is they do want to destabilize the European Commission and the European Parliament because for them, the European Parliament and the European Commission became too powerful. So that is a mechanism to destabilize them. On Brexit and parliaments with the seats, I don't think so, because I don't know what's happening in governments with regard to the European Parliament, but I'm sitting in a small group advising the Economic and Social Committee on ECOSOC post-Brexit. And one of the initiatives of this committee is that trade unionists have been called by some governments, at least Germany, that I'm allowed to say, but the German government say, listen guys, after Brexit, we have not so much money anymore for you. So we think your committee with less money. That means for the European Parliament, I don't think that you will get governments to say, well, we use the British seats for something else. No, say, no, we have less money, so it's a parliament which is a little bit more close to all these things. On Jens, on the info treatment and the sift of governments and the sectoral committees, yeah, I share. I mean, it would be a good idea. Problem with the select committees, or let's say the functional committees, I've seen with the fiscal compact, I mean, you have also dealt with that, is, well, there was in many countries a huge debate between the EU affairs committees and the budgetary committees or the finance committees, who is the competent committee in dealing in the Article 13 committee, in dealing with the fiscal compact on a parliamentary level. Now, the problem is that it's not a general rule, but in most of the cases, members sitting in the EU affairs committees tend to be a little bit more pro-European in general than those in the select committees, which always think from the national budget onwards. So they tend to be more nationalist. What I found a good example, I don't know because I always do not make the difference between them. It's either Latvia or Lithuania, where the EU affairs committee is composed from there's one bunch, composition is all chairs from the select committees are sitting in the EU affairs committees, and then some else. This is not bad, because it brings the functional expertise in the EU affairs committee. Yeah. Plus, I mean, if you use that kind of electronic voting, it would be a super idea.
Thank you very much. Heather, on the social crowdsourcing amendments, procedures, on aspects, on what impact does that have on content, on how to transmit content into the political process, on the quality of content, and maybe also on the European Youth Initiative and Youth Convention, and how, in your view, connecting parts of the population to the political process of the EU represents an option or rather an obstacle to bring broader groups of citizens in.
Okay. I don't have so much to say about the latter one, but I would like to make a comment on the Spitzenkandidaten thing, because I think it's about to come up and hit us again in 2019. But just on the first question about, how do you deal with the volume of information, because this is also, and volume of communication, because this is a problem for representatives too. I mean, the downside of citizen direct engagement on Twitter is just a huge amount of traffic, far more traffic than an individual MEP's office could possibly handle. And Nigel Farage, in fact, he is just basically a Twitter office. He doesn't get involved in committees. He doesn't work on legislation. He just manages his Twitter account with his team of assistants. And you would need that kind of resource in order to be able to do it. But I think the interesting thing about the way Marietje Schaake has done it is that she uses the crowdsourcing not as the amendments themselves necessarily, Marco, but as a method of data collection. And this is the key difference in terms of how to see that kind of consultation. Do you see it as a democratic process whereby you're beholden to to the people who answer that you will put forward every one of their amendments, or do you take it as data points of what is of concern to citizens, and then you take it as your role as their representative to filter them, to decide which are the most important, to gather them together? So in fact, it's really about asking for information, not promising to put all of those things forward. And that's very important with the point that several people have made about the expectations issue, that in a way, what you can do with technology raises expectations that politics may not be able to fulfill. I've noticed among NGOs, civil society in Brussels, a big frustration with the proliferation of consultations by the Commission and other institutions, because there's an assumption that when you go to a consultation and you express a view, that view will end up in the legislation or in the white paper or whatever, whereas actually it could be regarded as a data collection exercise. But this is very tricky. What exactly is it? And is it part of the democratic process, or is it part of the better policy-making process? These are two slightly different things, actually. Is it about participation, or is it about data collection? But so having a say is not the same as having a vote or a seat at the table. But the second issue is about parties themselves, because what we're seeing, a lot of the debate about Spitzenkandidaten, about the role of the party groups at EU level, is a reflection of the way that party systems are undergoing massive earthquakes within the member states. We're seeing the death of some old, long-standing parties. For example, PASOK has completely disappeared. Other parties, particularly on the left, look in danger of disappearing as well. So what impact does it have at EU level if party systems at national level break down? In France, and of course, as we saw in Austria with the presidential election last year, you see the majority of voters voting against mainstream party candidates, voting for the alternatives to mainstream parties. This is going to happen more. And that makes it very tricky if you argue that the main representation of European citizens is through party groups that the old mainstream parties belong to at EU level, especially if those party groups feel that they have to protect and defend their members when those members might be being voted out by the citizens. I think this is highly problematic. What's the future of PES and EPP if their members start to vanish? Now, maybe they'll collect new members, but at the moment there's no real exchange of members based on the wishes of citizens. It's a very path-dependent system. And I think this is where the Spitzenkandidaten thing comes in, because the system that was first tried out in 2014 and is highly likely to be used again in 2019 is the representatives of the old mainstream parties being put forward at the party groupings. So it's really easy for populists and other kinds of new parties to say, look, the insiders have an advantage. Look, we're not having a way of representing new interests and a new political energy in the system. So it reinforces the impression of a stitch-up between insiders, that if the choice is between Schulz and Juncker, the choice is between two German-speaking mainstream pro-Europeans. How much choice is that? I mean, the Eurosceptics and the outsider parties have a point there. And I think the other problem with the Spitzenkandidaten thing is it makes the Commission's role as a referee, guardian of the treaties, regulation, and so on, party political. And I think Bridget's point about the advantage of direct election, the key thing about that for me is that the president would be independent of that system. Even if the president is a member of his or her party at home, that person would not feel beholden to a particular party faction in the European Parliament and do deals with them. I find that, as a European citizen, a big problem, that the Commission, as guardian of the treaties, is listening much more to one political party grouping in the Parliament rather than the others. So is this about, independence matters, because it's not just, it's about accountability to the whole European Parliament, not a special relationship with one political party group. So I would argue strongly that the EU should not use the Spitzenkandidaten process. Again, and the risk of falling into the trap of, I told you so. I wrote a paper in 2013 saying why Spitzenkandidat was a really bad idea, and I think that is largely what's come about. But what's possible to do is to look forward to a more mobile system which allows for rotation between party groups in the European Parliament, which reflects much more quickly and accurately what's happening. So I would argue that the main party groupings should have a system of reviewing the membership of all of their constituent national parties at each European Parliament election, evaluating them according to democracy criteria. That could help with some of the recent problems with move towards illiberalism. They could also measure them on how far did they actually stick to party discipline. If you look at Vote Watch's data on how MEPs vote, there are some of the party groupings that have almost no party discipline among the MEPs. They don't feel obliged to vote with the party group, whereas others are much more tightly woven. And they could also evaluate the membership of those parties according to really how much support do they get at national level. So I think we shouldn't see these things as monoliths. It would help the EPP and PES, if I might suggest this, to survive if they did not regard party membership as something that just simply you grab as many MEPs as you possibly can to get as many positions and as much power as you have, but you actually stand for something and you evaluate your members on what you stand for.
Thanks a lot, Heather. Anthony, on that point, do you think that the detachment of members of parliament from their political parties due to increased ex-ante participation and participation of citizens over the cycle that then MEPs need to be responsive to, will create an expectations gap or false expectations of citizens? What impact would that have on voting within the parliament? And the second question, the oversight, collective oversight of national parliaments and the European parliaments in European policy areas. What do you think? Will this change the current system of scrutiny and oversight we have?
Well, thank you. On the second of those two, to do with national parliaments and the relationship with the European Union level, I think there's both good and bad news, and I'm responding very much to the intervention of the gentleman there earlier on. I mean, I think the good news is that there is an enormous amount of information which has been extracted through the national parliamentary scrutiny process. And if you want to see this in action, ask somebody in the Bundestag to show you the so-called EU docs, internal website, intranet that they have there. It is quite remarkable. In a very, very organized and systematic way, the European documentation relating to any particular legislative proposal or any major policy issue is set out in great detail, including the German government's account of each working group that they've attended in the Council. And these are not phony documents that have been created especially for national parliamentary consideration. They're the real documents. And that's partly as a result of rulings by the German Constitutional Court and the fact that there was an acceptance on both sides, by the government and by the Bundestag, that they really had to do something. Now, the question is, what do you do when that material is available? And this is the bad news, I think, which is that the incentive structure in national parliaments for individual members to take seriously EU scrutiny is very low. It doesn't lead, in general, to becoming a minister. It doesn't lead, in general, to becoming a very prominent public figure. It tends to attract people who are either very strong Euro enthusiasts or very strong Eurosceptics. It tends to be a rather introverted world of people who want to talk about Europe, a bit like us here in this room. It doesn't necessarily provide a conveyor belt to political visibility or political promotion. And I think that until and unless something's done about that incentive structure at national parliamentary level, you're going to get a continuation of the current rather unsatisfactory situation. That would be my view on that one. There was a question asked about, I think by Marco, about the what balance is the right balance to strike between party discipline and independence. And you said quite rightly that the data suggests that in the European Parliament the degree of cohesion is about 90% within at least the larger political groups. More or less the same level of cohesion that you find in the US Congress, in fact, in the two main the two political parties there. Whereas the expectation in most national parliaments is that the cohesion will be more like 100%. And sanctions are very often employed against people when they diverge in a way that it's much more difficult in the European Parliament or in the US Congress to employ sanctions against dissidents. Obviously, if you systematically vote against your party on all items, well, you have to ask the question as to whether or not you should really be in that political party. But that, I think, is the higher degree of tolerance that is going to evolve in practice at national level over time. And I think rather than the European Parliament having a problem with this, I would say to some degree the European Parliament is a sort of harbinger of what's going to happen in the future. Of course that's going to make governing more difficult for the executive. That goes without saying. But in the kind of society that's evolving, a command and control notion that because we had election 3 years ago or 5 years ago, this government, and it should have a disciplined majority behind it, can do pretty much whatever it wants, I think that's disappearing from what's politically and publicly acceptable. So I don't see it so much as a problem. If I may, just on another point on the Spitzenkandidat, I'm not going to get drawn into the question of the rights and wrongs of the Spitzenkandidat, but I think there's a bit of a contradiction, if I may say so, Bridget, in your position, because you're advocating on the one hand that the Commission President should be directly elected, but you're also willing to countenance, presumably at the next European election, an experiment with a transnational list of 73 members across the whole EU. But of course, these would be Spitzenteams in practice. They would be teams designed to, nominated by the political parties at transnational level, designed to support whoever the Spitzenkandidat might be in each political family. And the commissioners would almost certainly be drawn from those Spitzenteams. So the allocation of the 73 seats to a transnational constituency would probably have the effect of further entrenching and enhancing the Spitzenkandidat process. It's not an alternative to it.
But not necessarily.
Well,
you can have a transnational list where we vote for MEPs who sit in the European Parliament. They don't necessarily have to be led by a Spitzenkandidat.
No, they don't, but there would be a very strong tendency, I think, on the part of the EPP, the PES, ALDE, etc., to go down that route. And it would be also quite politically convenient for identifying in advance what the pool of talent was, as it were, for drawing on as future commissioners. I agree it's not an absolutely necessary consequence, but I would have thought politically it was quite a likely one.
Thank you very much. We need once more the microphone because we have one question open, and given that we started a bit late, I think we should integrate that. Perfect, thank you very much. And then we still have the question on regional parliaments that Andreas wanted to respond to in the last round. Just waiting. Yeah. Or do you want to? No, good, perfect. In the first row, please. Thank you very much.
Ricardo Ribera, Director General, Internal Policies, the European Parliament. It means the Director General dealing with legislation in 20 parliamentary committees. First, I thank you for all this contribution, very much complimentary, for these very interesting data about the European citizens, which I would consider one side encouraging but also challenging. Challenges because it doesn't mean that European citizens are just against, or the majority of against the European Union, but they are waiting for the European Union delivering European Union more inclusive, and especially this data about declining confidence to be more involved, I think is really particularly challenging. And also in European Union, which is more accountable. I find also very interesting the example mentioned by Brigitte Laffen about the Troika, because the Parliament had strong reservations about the role of the Troika. And therefore this kind of process, which was put in place in the case of Ireland, I think was also very interesting for the European Parliament, because it made possible that Parliament, when adopting legislation, European governance, was including elements of greater democratic accountability, for example, in legislation on six-pack and two-pack. It means also how the cooperation between academia, parliamentarians, and citizens can provide very useful inputs. Last point on the issue of the Spitzenkandidat, I think this issue will deserve some more reflections. I would say in the parliament systems, especially among the big political families, is rather quite, let's say, popular. But here it's been mentioned correctly, I think, one issue, very important, the independence of the European Commission. How does also had another element? We are also to preserve the independence of the European Parliament. Because when you just apply a domestic model where in the way the parliament or the parliamentary majority has just an interest in supporting the executive, it means that this majority cannot exert really the proper oversight we want to exercise in the European Parliament. It's the reason why I think that this system deserves real, let's say, kind of renewed discussions. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Riccardo. So if there's I think I'm going to hand over to Andreas for the last response, maybe also with some reactions to Riccardo very shortly, because then from our experience, there's nothing better than good Tuscan food to deliberate further on the future of Europe, which will expect us afterwards, and we don't want to keep you too long from that. So Andreas, please.
Just because I don't like it, people representing regions are disappointed because they do not get the answer. The Journal of Legislative Studies is coming out with a special issue on the role of subnational and regional parliaments in European affairs. I don't know when. I'm an author. We just got the edited pages, so to finally correct. It will be this year. And there's an article by Anne Epler and myself on an empirical study, it's all typical number crunching and blah, 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 on Calre, Salur, Lux, and the Baltic Assembly, parliamentary assemblies, which is really, really disappointing. Calre is dealing with itself. The Salur Lux, which is the oldest one of these three, is dealing also with some kind of ex-ante control and scrutiny. So they are addressing the regional governments, that's okay, but they do not implement and control. And the Baltic Assembly, by definition, is a deliberate body. They do not even want to control, to scrutinize. They want to speak on whatever they like. Final point on the Spitzenkandidaten to Riccardo. I mean, again, I'm always try to think from the end. If I think the Spitzenkandidaten model from the end, we would have a European Parliament pushed to be completely disciplined towards the Spitzenkandidat like we know it from national parliaments, which would mean that the European Parliament would be a dependent rubber stamp machinery for the government. I do not like this kind of parliament. I think one of the good things of the European Parliament, like the Swiss Parliament or the US Congress, is that they are independent. They are a little bit more independent than we are used to from our national member states.
Thank you very much, Andreas. Anyone wants to have a final word on the panel? If not, then I thank. On the youth convention and the.
So just very briefly, it depends on what the purpose of the convention is to be. If the purpose of the convention is a new treaty for Europe, in my view, the problems in the EU are not crucially at this stage treaty-based or institutional. I think the problem in Europe, the problems are political. And to be honest, I think that you could have a convention to frame and identify key issues to be addressed, but one more treaty, in my view, is not what the EU now needs.
Thank you very much, Bridget, and all the panelists. I thank you for participating in the audience, for the very interesting discussion we had, and we're very happy to continue the discussion on one or the other thought over the reception that we will have in the garden. Thank you very much.